Hey everyone! Today's story is about a noble girl who gets reincarnated and suddenly remembers her past life as a top businesswoman. But instead of living peacefully, she's stuck in a struggling territory on the verge of collapse. So she decides to use her knowledge and money to take control of everything. So with that said, let's begin the story. The girl recalled the voices she used to hear all the time. They told her she had no business wandering around the mansion as if it were her own, calling her a pathetic commoner. All these thoughts raced through her mind as she sank into the lake. She closed her eyes and thought, if only this time she could fall in love properly and get married. Suddenly, she opened her eyes and stared blankly into space. Why had her thoughts been exactly like that? Why this time? Could it really mean that? The next time the main character opened her eyes, she was lying in her room in a big bed. She had a fever. She was clearly sick. The main character, who remembered her entire life after falling into the pond, was named Sarah. She was 8 years old. She opened her eyes with difficulty, all red from her illness, and muttered to herself that this was what it meant to be transported to another world. In novels about another world, everything is beautiful and wonderful, but in reality, it's not like that at all. She began to recall her past. In her previous life, she had been Uno Saresa, a woman in her 30s. She worked at a trading company and was an analyst through and through. Her life motto was, "Love can wait. It'll work out somehow later." In that life, she had died, apparently in an accident, but her memories of that time were very hazy. But she clearly remembered that she never got to drink the wine she had been saving. In her past life, she clearly loved to drink. In this life, she, Sarah, lived happily with her parents, who ran a small shop, until they died. Then it turned out that her father was the third son of the Marquis of Grantchester and had run away from his family with her mother, because of the difference in their social status. The girl only found out about this when her grandfather took her in, 6 months ago. Even when she lay sick in her room, she constantly heard from behind the door that she was a commoner, that she didn't belong here, and that she was just a girl. Constant jabs from her uncle and aunt, bullying from her cousins. Life in the Marquis's house was quite a pleasure. If things continued this way, an unwanted political marriage awaited her. Given the circumstances, she would surely be married off to some ugly oaf. The Sarah of the past would probably have just resigned herself to it. But the Sarah of the present remembers her past life and knows what it means to be in control of her own destiny and what the true price of freedom is. The heroine sat up in bed and settled in comfortably. She removed the damp cloth from her forehead, rubbed her chin thoughtfully, and considered. She didn't want to lose her comfort, so it would be better to remain a wealthy commoner, and use the knowledge from her past life to become a merchant. Then she chuckled aloud and muttered that it sounded pretty good. Until she came of age, she would rely on her family's support and save money. Now her goal in this life was to become a merchant, save up startup capital, and learn to earn her own living. When the girl felt better, the first thing she did was go to her grandfather, the Marquis of Grantchester. He was sitting at a lavishly set table. Her grandfather asked her to clarify whether she was certain she wanted to live in the Grantchester estates. The heroine nodded, folding her hands in front of her, and thought, to save money for her freedom, she needed 2 things. A safe place free from persecution and knowledge of this world, which meant she should move to the Grantchester estates to learn and gather strength. At that moment, she was with her grandfather in his mansion in the capital, not far from where his estates began. In this life, she would do anything for freedom. But of course, she couldn't say that outright. So she told her grandfather aloud that she wanted to see the lands of Grantchester with her own eyes and experience what it was like to live there. Her own father came from there. Even if she was a distant relative, Grantchester blood still flowed through her veins. She couldn't just sit idly by so as not to be a burden to anyone. She felt it was necessary to strengthen her spirit and gather her strength. She would have continued her speech, but her grandfather frowned and cut her off, asking if those weren't 2 grown-up words for a child. Was she really 8? The girl immediately frowned and waved her hands, saying that if you grow up in a merchant family, you inevitably start watching your words. Grandfather clasped his hands in front of him, nodded, and said he would arrange for the move and hire a governess for her. Sarah immediately brightened up and sincerely thanked him. So 2 goals from her list had been accomplished, finding a safe environment free from bullying and getting the chance to study. Then she went to her room. As she passed the staircase, a boyish voice called out to her, calling her a commoner. It was Adam, Sarah's cousin. He started coming down the stairs as soon as he saw the girl and asked mockingly, did she really think she could do whatever she wanted in the lands of Grantchester? She thought to herself with annoyance that he was the ringleader of a gang of pesky cousins. It was he who pushed her into the pond and ran away without saying a word to anyone. She showed not a single emotion on her face. She merely turned to the man speaking, bowed slightly, and addressed him as Mr. Adam. He smiled haughtily, stepped closer, and said that her uncle wasn't a soft-hearted man, constantly yelling study, and that he would be especially strict with illiterate people like Sarah. The main character smirked. Then she put on a completely innocent expression, widened her eyes, and thanked him for the thoughtful advice. The boy recoiled, blushing slightly, and exclaimed something unintelligible in surprise. Ignoring him, the girl turned and headed toward her room, hiding her displeasure. Adam watched her go and thought that something was clearly wrong with Sarah. The main character walked ahead with a sullen look on her face, and she thought there wasn't much left on her list to take revenge on her cousins. After a while, they set out for the Grantchester estates. It was a 3-day carriage ride from the mansion in the capital. Mary, Sarah's personal maid, sat across from the girl, frowning in displeasure. Noticing her mood, Sarah asked if something was wrong. The maid folded her hands in front of her and said no, nothing, and apologized. But then she frowned again and blurted out. It was because of this that Adam and the others had pushed Sarah into the pond. If they hadn't found her in time, she could have died, and none of them were punished in any way. The girl couldn't accept this and was determined to find a way to tell the Marquis everything. Sarah shook her head slightly and muttered calmly that it was useless. There's no proof, and without it, they'll only be setting themselves up. An image flashed through her mind of her aunt, who had shielded her face with a fan and said that such a lie was sheer audacity, typical of a commoner. Then the girl gave a slight wink, frowned, and said conspiratorially, "And who said she wasn't going to seek revenge?" The maid gasped. Then Sarah began to explain her plan. Adam had a nasty habit, stealing and collecting the maid's underwear. She was going to sneak into his room and dump everything she found in his collection onto the bed, just as the maids were cleaning his room. They would see it all. That's how the deadly technique works. The nanny finds erotic content, the schoolboy's execution. For the second one, Christopher, she'll just slightly ruin his mattress and pants. And then the maids, noticing this, would frown disapprovingly and ask, "Does he still wet the bed?" And the boy would be punished. For the remaining girl, Chloe, she'll gradually strip the moisture from her precious hair. Her hair will become completely unkempt. This is how the forbidden technique is applied. Breaking the cuticle, the execution of beauty. The maid listened to her speech and asked, slightly confused, "Squeeze the moisture out of the hair? Cuticle? Schoolboy?" She didn't quite understand what exactly that meant, but could the girl really do such a thing? The main character waved her hand slightly and muttered that the details weren't that important. And to herself she added, she'd forgotten to mention that she possessed magic. In the world where the main character was reborn, magic exists, but not everyone possesses it. Most often, it manifests in nobles, and it's considered a great stroke of luck. Sarah's water magic awakened when she fell into a pond. Apparently, that's why she didn't drown, although she has no intention of telling anyone about her past life or her magic. And so she launched into a strange explanation to the maid, silently asking for her forgiveness. And so, a plan for revenge against her cousins was hatched. After some time, the main character arrived at the estate with her maid. The girl stepped out of the carriage, stopped in front of the castle, and murmured in awe, "So this is what Grantchester Castle looks like." The girl folded her hands in front of her in admiration and murmured that everything here was so beautiful. She definitely wanted to explore every corner. In her past life, she had been a true history buff, and ancient castles had always filled her with delight. A few minutes later, a pleasant male voice snapped them out of their admiration of the mansion. A man in his 30s was walking toward them, tall, with light hair neatly combed back and warm gray eyes. He introduced himself as Robert and said in a pleasant voice that he was pleased to meet Sarah, adding that he was her second uncle. Seeing the man approaching, Sarah steeled herself, pressed her lips together, and thought that the most important task had begun. To live a peaceful life, she needed to make a good impression on her uncle. The main thing was not to mess up in the first few minutes. She made a small curtsy, tilting her head slightly, and introduced herself in a gentle voice, then asked, could she call the man Uncle Robert, or was Lord Grantchester better? Uncle looked at the girl in surprise. Then he chuckled softly and muttered that she was so serious. In a friendlier tone, he told her to just call him Rob. The girl looked up at him in surprise, and she saw him extend his hand with a gentle smile and offer to show her the castle. The heroine looked at him with a slight sparkle in her eyes and thought that this man was very much like her father. For quite a long time, the two of them walked around the castle. The man showed her all the places he considered interesting. Last of all, they climbed up to the castle wall, where a stunning view of the estate unfolded before them. It was just sunset, and the scene was simply breathtaking. Everything around them was bathed in a warm, golden pink light. The fields and forests stretched to the horizon, and the distant river glistened like molten silver in the rays of the setting sun. The wind ruffled the girl's hair slightly. She tucked a strand behind her ear and murmured that the view was very beautiful. Robert looked at her with a gentle smile and asked if she liked it here. The heroine nodded vigorously and said that of course she did. He looked ahead and said that he liked these lands too. His brother Arthur often loved to admire these views. Sarah raised her hand to her lips and asked in surprise, "Dad?" Then she stopped short and corrected herself. Did father like to look at them, too? Robert quietly closed his eyes and said gently that she could call him Dad instead of father when she was with him. After all, they were family. Then he added that Sarah was a very smart girl and knew how to adapt her speech to the situation. The main character awkwardly scratched her cheek with her finger and muttered that she wasn't sure about that. Robert nodded, then said it was fine. She was Arthur's daughter, after all. Sarah tilted her head to the side and asked what he meant. Robert continued. Arthur knew how to pretend to be perfect. Everyone fell for his sweet smile, and girls were practically falling over themselves for him. The heroine widened her eyes in surprise, raised her eyebrows, and asked, "So, despite all that, he actually married a commoner?" The man looked away and said that her mother, Adelia, hadn't fallen for his act. She immediately recognized the fake, nasty smile, and that really got to Arthur. He had been trying to persuade her for so long that she eventually gave in. The girl gasped in surprise at this story, thinking to herself, Mom and Dad, they have such an interesting story. Then she laughed softly, covering her mouth with her hand, and she thought, the Marquis's son and Dad was so strange. Robert smiled as he looked at his niece and murmured that he was very happy to meet her. The girl smiled, and she realized she had finally found a place where she could quietly save money for her independence. The next day, she would have to establish a relationship with the governess. Her uncle said that this was Rebecca, a childhood friend of his and Arthur's. Walking to the meeting in the garden, Sarah thought to herself that the woman was probably around 30 years old. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't notice another person standing right in front of her. The girl stopped, pressed her hand to her chest, and smiled. A gentle, friendly smile that didn't fit at all with her strict hairstyle and impeccably dark dress with a high collar and neat cuffs. The main character gasped to herself. She's so young, at most 18 years old. Noticing the main character's expression, the girl tilted her head in surprise. Sarah caught herself, introduced herself, and apologized to, explaining that she was simply surprised that she looked so young. She had heard that Rebecca was her father's childhood friend. Could that really be true? The girl asked again, what a clever girl. Then she closed her eyes, paused for a moment, and said that she actually had a friend, a fairy. Sarah thought to herself, some fairies make a contract with someone they like and give them power. A fairy's magic slows down aging. This is called a fairy's blessing. The girl adopted a slightly more serious expression and said that someday she would definitely introduce her to her friend. But asking someone's age upon first meeting is very rude. The girl was slightly embarrassed and apologized. The next second, the governess crouched down in front of her to be at eye level. Rebecca smiled slightly and told the girl that, to be honest, this was her first time working as a governess, so it wouldn't be easy for either of them. But she suggested they try their best together. The main character nodded in agreement. So another task from her plan had been completed. She had established a rapport with the governess. A little later that same day, the two of them were sitting in the gazebo drinking tea, which had been served by a maid who was now standing off to the side. Rebecca remarked that even though the girl had grown up among ordinary people, she spoke very politely, and if she practiced a little, everything would be fine. But she still needed to learn how to choose topics and understand aristocratic turns of phrase. The heroine grimaced slightly and muttered that it seemed she would need quite a lot of knowledge. The governess nodded and confirmed this. Then she frowned slightly and said with the utmost seriousness that, without knowing her conversation partner's status and her family's affairs, without history, theater, and the like, she wouldn't even be able to tell if they were praising her or mocking her. That is precisely why an education is the first priority. Sarah paled slightly and muttered that it all sounded rather scary. Rebecca, trying to smooth things over a bit, said that as long as she was a child, she would be forgiven for a lot. But ignorance can lead to offending someone or failing to notice mockery, and then life among the nobility will turn into a living hell. The main character paused and said that she was already scared by all of this. The governess smiled and explained that this was precisely why noble children were educated from a very young age. Sarah picked up her cup and thought that in her past life, she had seen the so-called elite trading veiled barbs at parties. Back then, she had simply watched from the sidelines, but now she would find herself right in the middle of this circus. It's a total nightmare, but for the sake of her freedom, she was willing to endure it. Now she had added to her list the need to figure out exactly what she should study. Etiquette, speech manners, history, literature, theater, the language of flowers, and magic. Suddenly, Robert interrupted their conversation. He walked over, turned to Rebecca, and said they hadn't seen each other in a long time. And he paid her a compliment, that she looked great. Rebecca replied that Rob didn't look bad either. The man decided to join them, sat down at the table on the third side, and muttered that lately he'd been feeling more and more that he was getting old, but she was just as young as she'd always been. Then he let out a dejected sigh, chuckled a little, and muttered that he wished he could befriend a fairy too. The governess laughed and told him not to even get his hopes up. If a fairy ever got involved with him, he'd definitely make her do paperwork, and dealing with him was dangerous to one's health. The man laughed and muttered that that was true too. Watching this scene, the main character smiled and thought that this was true childhood friendship with no filters. Suddenly, her eyes widened slightly as she looked at the man in surprise. He looked like a man pushed to the limits of exhaustion. Dark circles under his eyes, though he was trying to hide them. The main character turned to him and asked if her uncle was tired. The man clasped his hands in front of him. He explained that he'd had too much work lately and that he'd hated bookkeeping since childhood. The main character asked again and clarified. Could it be that he was doing the bookkeeping himself? The man dropped his head into his hands in utter exhaustion and explained that they used to have a treasurer, but a couple of years ago it turned out that the man had been stealing. To herself, the main character thought with displeasure, what kind of treasurer steals from the treasury? Not noticing the change in his niece's mood, Robert continued, saying that after that, his father had declared that no one could be trusted with the finances, and he himself had had to take charge of the matter. Sarah frowned in displeasure and resolutely defended her uncle, saying that even professionals find it difficult to count money. The man paled slightly and was about to turn to his childhood friend, but then Rebecca spoke up herself. She addressed her ward. She said that ladies don't talk about money. It's considered vulgar. Though she completely understood the girl, the man tried to interject, muttering, "Can I say something?" But the girls paid him no attention. The main character widened her eyes and said discontentedly, "But money is important, isn't it?" The governess nodded in agreement and said that proper ladies should leave financial matters to men. At these words, the girl jumped up from her seat and exclaimed that this was complete nonsense. For a couple of seconds, the governess was taken aback, but then she smiled, seeing a kindred spirit in the girl, and said she agreed with her, that she felt the same way. But she added instructively that if a woman meddles in financial matters, it looks as though her father or husband can't handle things, which causes disputes and gossip among the elite. To herself, Sarah muttered that it was unfair, and then she thought that her past life and her present one, commoners and nobles, had different values, but it still infuriated her. And she mused that money really is important. Robert asked, "Is everything really different for commoners?" The main character explained that among ordinary people, if a husband is lazy, the wife is obligated to give him a kick. At the shop she ran with her parents, she and her mom recorded the takings together. And although her father was the one who actually entered the figures into the ledger and the monthly reports, she and her mother were just there to help him. At these words, Robert gasped in surprise, then frowned slightly and muttered that it turned out Sarah knew how to keep accounts. She replied that if it wasn't too complicated, then yes, she could. The man continued to press her. Could she also do math? The girl said that if it was simple calculations, then yes, she could, and thought to herself, why was he even asking such questions? The next second, Robert stood up. He turned to the girl and asked if she would help him with his work. The main character gasped in surprise, turned pale, and asked, how could she? That's when Rebecca stepped in, frowned, and asked, is Rob serious? The man flinched slightly, but began to defend himself fiercely, saying that of course her studies would come first, and that he'd actually wanted to ask Rebecca the same thing. The girl gasped. The man continued, saying that, to be honest, he had hired her as a governess partly for this very reason. Besides, she herself had wanted to consult him. Wasn't that so? Rebecca shouted furiously that such things needed to be discussed in advance. Robert muttered, stung, that if he'd said anything beforehand, she wouldn't have come at all. The governess muttered back, do you really think I would have? Then she hesitated and reluctantly mumbled that it seemed he was right after all. To herself, the heroine began to piece together the picture from what her uncle had explained. Previously, the finances had been managed by an administrator from a branch of the family and the treasurer, but it turned out that the two had conspired and had been stealing from the treasury for years. Since they were relatives of the main family, no one suspected them, and it all continued until someone ratted them out. That was 2 years ago. Money, gold, jewels, paintings, furniture, everything had disappeared. Less than half of the wheat reserves remained. It was a complete nightmare. Lost in thought, the main character suddenly gasped quietly. This is a financial catastrophe in the lands of Grantchester. Now the top priority in her plan is to resolve the financial crisis on her estate. The main character turned pale with panic and began frantically thinking that if the family went bankrupt, she would be the first to be kicked out, and her entire plan to become rich and live the high life would collapse in an instant. Uncle Robert, noticing how pale she had become, laughed awkwardly, covered his eyes, and muttered that he hadn't even thought the girl knew how to count. Well, of course, she was Arthur's daughter, so she was naturally so capable. That's when Rebecca stepped in, tugged on her childhood friend's sleeve, and asked him to wait. Frowning slightly, she approached the girl and asked, "Is it really true that she can count?" A few minutes later, they brought a board with various examples and gave her time to calculate everything. After a couple of minutes, everything was ready. The main character said she was done and asked, "Do I need to include the fractions in the answer?" Rebecca, looking at the results and seeing that everything was correct, muttered that the girl even understood decimals. "She's a real genius." Uncle Robert echoed the same thought a split second later. The main character picked up her cup, took a sip, and thought to herself, slightly bewildered, that there was nothing complicated about it. Uncle Robert closed his eyes again, smiled, and quietly said that if Sarah were a boy, he would have already sent her to the academy early. The Royal Academy is the country's only state educational institution, something like a school, university, and research institute all in one. Only boys between the ages of 10 and 15 can enroll there. Sarah bowed her head slightly, looking dejected, pouted her lips, and muttered that it seemed girls couldn't study the same way as boys, which upset her greatly. At that, Rebecca smiled gently, closed her eyes, and murmured that she used to think exactly the same way. Noticing that the governess had begun to tell a story, the main character looked at her in surprise and tilted her head slightly, as if to say, "I want to hear more." Then the girl continued. She loved to study, so she asked her father to send her to the academy. And for that, he locked her in the tower for 2 days and gave her no food. After hearing this, the main character jumped up in horror and cried out that it was simply awful, that one shouldn't do such a thing. Rebecca nodded. She smiled gently at this reaction, then continued and asked if Sarah knew who had saved her back then. It was Robert and Arthur. They taught her everything she learned at the academy. Then Robert spoke up and said that Arthur had mostly explained everything, while he himself had simply repeated it along with Rebecca. Sarah asked in surprise, "Wait, but isn't your father the younger one?" Her uncle nodded, smiled, and said that he and Arthur had entered the academy in the same year. Arthur had always been at the top of the class, while he himself had barely managed to stay from being expelled. After saying this, he looked at his childhood friend and smiled. Rebecca laughed softly in response, looked at him, and said that it was all because Robert had been swinging a sword instead of studying. Looking at the scene before her, 2 adults gazing tenderly at each other, the girl realized that these two were clearly in love and much closer than they wanted to show. A short while later, Uncle Robert and the main character decided that since they were convinced Sarah knew a lot, it was time to get down to business. Namely, to sort out the information about the thefts. The 3 of them walked down the hallway and discussed how the scale of the theft was such that they still didn't know exactly what had disappeared or how many paintings, valuables, and other property were missing. The girl interrupted and asked in shock, "But they found out about this incident 2 years ago. How is it possible that they still haven't figured everything out?" Robert sighed heavily, waved his hand, and said, "In short, there weren't enough people. Most of the officials had served the old steward and the treasurer, that is, the thieves themselves. After the scandal broke, many fled, the rest were imprisoned, and there simply weren't any people left." The main character looked at her dejected uncle and asked in surprise, "Why not announce a recruitment drive for new people in the capital?" The man looked at her quietly, put a finger to his lips, and said that they couldn't let the other houses find out about the embezzlement. The main character still didn't understand what the problem was and asked why. Her uncle explained that there was a high probability that the treasurer and the old steward had also been underreporting the wheat harvest. Then Rebecca spoke up, thoughtfully pressing her fist to her mouth, rubbing her chin, and saying that now everything made sense. The wheat tax is calculated based on the amount of the harvested crop. If they were underreporting the figures, it meant that Grantchester was evading taxes. And for the high nobility, that was a terrible scandal. Sarah widened her eyes and muttered in confusion that they themselves were victims of theft. Robert nodded, but humbly said that the responsibility for oversight still lay with Grantchester. In the worst-case scenario, they could take away her lands and her title. Hearing these words, the main character turned pale again and muttered in confusion that this couldn't be true. Then Uncle Robert looked at his niece and continued. To avoid this, they needed to submit a corrected declaration themselves before the audit and pay everything off. It would look like a mistake in the reports. They recalculated, paid up, and the matter was closed. The next scheduled audit is in 3 years. Until then, they need to figure out the full extent of what happened. By the time he finished speaking, the 3 of them had already reached the right spot. The man placed his hand on the symbol on the door, and it lit up brightly. Then Robert continued, glancing at his companions. If the estates arouse suspicion, they might order an urgent inspection, so they can't hire officials en masse in the capital. The main character nodded in agreement and muttered that if she understood correctly, if the other houses suspected something, the likelihood of an emergency inspection would increase. To herself, she thought that this was far worse than she had imagined. Distracted by these gloomy thoughts, she rubbed her forehead in frustration, as if she had a headache. Her main goal in the near future is to resolve the estate's financial crisis, specifically by filing an amended tax return and paying off the debt. To do this, she needs to determine the extent of the embezzlement. The deadline is 3 years. The problem was a shortage of officials. A possible solution was to recruit people in the capital, but then there was a risk that other estates would find out. And if they found out, the audit might happen much sooner. A heavy silence hung in the air. Suddenly, Sarah seemed to realize something. She looked at her uncle and said that if she understood correctly, in a few years they would all have to pay enormous taxes. But in a mansion in the capital, no one was even trying to save money. Robert sighed heavily and said that they couldn't give up their social life just because of what others might think. Rebecca frowned and muttered in response that there was a limit to everything. Modesty, too, should be a virtue of a noble woman. For example, the wife of the junior marquis and her daughter Chloe bought a pile of new dresses and jewelry every season. There was bitterness in her voice. At these words, Robert's face brightened and he began to literally beam. Noticing this reaction, Rebecca asked what he wanted. The man smiled and said that Becca was indeed very observant, even though just a couple of minutes ago Sarah had said that it was improper for a lady to count money. Rebecca awkwardly uttered some sounds but couldn't think of a reply, merely fiddling with the hem of her sleeve. Robert grinned widely and said with a playful, tender smile that she had indeed learned to be a proper lady, but the mischievous little Becca hadn't gone anywhere. The governess blushed to the tips of her ears, frowned, and shouted furiously that Robert mustn't dare speak that way in front of Sarah. Then she spun around sharply and strode away quickly, her heels clicking against the stone floor. The uncle and niece remained standing where they were. The man awkwardly scratched the back of his head and, watching her go, asked, had he really made her angry? The heroine slapped her forehead and sighed heavily, saying that was too much. And then she continued, saying that if someone had said that to her, she would never have helped her uncle. It was like harassment. The man looked at the girl in confusion and asked, what kind of harassment? His face stretched in surprise. Sarah wasn't swayed by his bewildered look or innocent expression. She frowned and said she meant what she said. After hearing his niece's words, Robert rubbed his chin even harder, turned pale, and muttered that, well, he'd definitely messed up this time. He even slumped a little. Looking at her uncle, Sarah frowned and thought she seemed to understand why he was still a bachelor. Without wasting any time, Robert went to apologize to the girl, who was seething with anger. His steps were uncertain at first, but then they quickened. After a while, the three of them walked into the service wing. Robert said to his niece that he would now show her the office building. There was a game room and a place where officials socialized. Watching the adults, the girl thought discontentedly that his governess had forgiven him quickly, just a few minutes of resentment, and they were already together again. Rebecca didn't pay attention to the girl's strange expression and asked her childhood friend, did he really want her and Sarah to work seriously? She thought they would just be secretaries in his office. Robert awkwardly scratched the back of his head and said he thought so too, but two officials had already collapsed from exhaustion. There was no time for laid-back plans now. To herself, the girl mentally gasped, her eyes widening. This was literally hellish work. Rebecca continued to protest, asking if Robert was out of his mind. She could handle it, fine, but making Sarah work? The man couldn't say anything in response. He too threw his hands up, raised his voice, and said that Grantchester couldn't afford to ignore talented people right now. Rebecca frowned even more. She pursed her lips, turned around, grabbed her ward by the arm, and told her they were going home. She would never allow a minor to work under such conditions. Sarah took a few steps forward, but then she stopped and gently let go of the girl's hand. Rebecca looked at the main character in surprise and asked why she had stopped. Sarah bowed her head, folded her hands in front of her, as if she were guilty, and said that if she helped even a little, the work would move faster. If they didn't finish in time for the inspection, Grantchester could go under. Then she raised her head fiercely, frowned deeply, and said seriously that since part of Grantchester was at stake, it was no longer someone else's problem. The governess blushed slightly, opened her eyes wide, looked at the girl, and quietly murmured her name. Then, seeing the determined expression on her face, she smiled and nodded. She took a few steps toward her and humbly said that if her pupil said so, then of course she had no right to abandon her. So, for a time, two female officials appeared in the lands of Grantchester, albeit part-time. Sarah combined work with her studies, while Rebecca worked as both a teacher and an official. One afternoon, the girl approached her uncle and asked for clarification. She'd been told that her uncle loved education very much, but now he was actually cutting back on class time. Was that fair? She stood with her arms crossed over her chest. Robert looked at his niece, sighed heavily, and said that compared to those good-for-nothings, it would actually be good for her. By good-for-nothings, he meant Sarah's cousins, who knew nothing but how to loaf around. So Sarah and Rebecca now work as clerks. It was another step in her plan, albeit not quite what she had originally envisioned, but still a step forward. After a while, Sarah and Rebecca settled into the office. The girl sat at the desk and looked intently at her teacher. Rebecca said, folding her hands in front of her with a small smile, that work was of course important, but they wouldn't neglect their studies either. The main character looked at the girl cautiously and nodded in agreement, for she was counting on her. So a new item appeared on her to-do list. Give it her all at work and in her studies. Rebecca suggested they start by outlining a general daily schedule. Wake up at 6 in the morning, get ready, and have breakfast. Classes start at 8. After lunch, from 1 to 2, more studying. Then they head to the office building, take a short break, and from 3 to 5 they help Robert with his work. After work, they return to the main house, bathe, and have dinner. After dinner, free time. Lights out at 8. Hearing those last words, the main character asked in surprise, "Isn't that too early to go to bed?" The governess held up her index finger instructively and said that for her age, it was perfectly normal. Sarah nodded and muttered that she understood everything, but then there would only be 2 hours left for work. Was overtime possible? In her past life, she had been a workaholic, and in this one, it was hard for her to be any different. The girl frowned, folded her arms across her chest in displeasure, and shook her head, saying that overtime was forbidden for the children. The main character asked, "What if I use my free time in the evening? Can I work then?" Rebecca replied sternly that she was against abuse of the system. Taking documents home was strictly forbidden. Besides, she could assign homework. There was a gentle yet unyielding sternness in her tone. Sighing heavily and looking at her dejected pupil, Rebecca continued, saying that they would agree on the following. After lunch, Sarah would choose whether to study or work. The girl nodded and mumbled that she understood everything. The next day's morning lesson was public speaking and etiquette. The governess stood by the window, watching her pupil, who was sitting at the table. The morning light fell on the polished tabletop, reflecting in glints. The governess turned to her pupil and said that they would begin by learning the aristocratic class system until it became second nature. Noticing the girl's displeased expression, she continued, "Manner of speech and behavior depend on the status of the person you're speaking with. You must be able to adapt instantly to any situation. It's like changing masks, one for superiors, another for equals, and a third for servants." Sarah was overcome by unpleasant memories of the main Grantchester mansion in the capital, where her cousins had called her a commoner and treated her with contempt. Inside, she felt a tight knot of resentment, but she held it in. Out loud, she scowled and said she understood everything. Rebecca said that it's just as important to be able to write beautiful letters. Sarah looked at her teacher with enthusiasm and asked, "How about we keep a correspondence journal together as practice? After all, it would be excellent practice for writing and choosing the right words." Rebecca leaned toward the girl and said with a smile that it was a good idea. A flash of approval crossed her eyes. Later that same day, practice in graceful walking and curtsying. The girl walked carefully around the room, following all of Rebecca's instructions. The floor was smooth, polished to a shine, and Sarah had to watch every step so as not to slip. The governess constantly made comments, frowned disapprovingly, and said, "Lower your chin, lower your gaze, just a little more. Don't slouch. Watch your whole body from head to toe. Even your fingertips must be graceful. Bow deeper, more smoothly." Then, when she did it well, the teacher said everything was fine. Hold that pose. In the presence of distinguished aristocrats, one must not raise one's head without permission. Then she remarked disapprovingly that the girl was swaying slightly. From the strain, Sarah fell to her knees and thought disappointedly that she mustn't relax. In aristocratic society, this is vital. Her breathing became irregular, and beads of sweat appeared on her forehead. Then she pulled herself together, raised her head, and thought that learning new things and mastering skills was actually very interesting. Looking at her student's flushed face, Rebecca smiled too. Her smile radiated pride. After lunch, work in the service building. Both girls went there to help. The main character straightened up, looked around, and exclaimed loudly that it was time to get to work, then apologized for barging in. Then, from behind a huge pile of papers, her Uncle Robert peeked out and greeted both girls. He looked severely exhausted. He had dark circles under his eyes, his face was pale, and his hair was tousled. The main character paled slightly at the sight and was simply horrified. 2 other officials sat next to her uncle, just as tired, with vacant stares. All the tables around them were piled high, with papers and various books that needed to be checked. The air smelled of dust and old ink, and a single candle burned somewhere in the corner. The girl asked, disgruntled and almost panicked, "Do we really have to go through all these documents?" Robert shrugged and muttered wearily that this was only a small part of it. Sarah and Rebecca froze in the doorway, staring at the room before them. Both thought roughly the same thing to themselves. Could all of this really be true? Rebecca frowned deeply. Then, without changing her expression, she stretched her lips into a completely serene smile, the very one that, as Sarah had already noticed, signaled genuine gloom in the governess. With that smile, she turned to Robert and politely asked him to explain in more detail. She and Sarah had come to help. That much was true. But how were they even supposed to make sense of such chaos? Sarah glanced at the governess and thought, this is truly terrifying. A flawless smile, a straight back, not a single unnecessary emotion on her face. A true, well-bred lady in action. At that moment, one of Robert's subordinates stood up, a middle-aged man sitting at the nearest table. He addressed the gentleman briefly, and then, barely changing his tone, he asked, could these two really be the promised help? The second official, without standing up, nodded in agreement, and, casting a dismissive glance at the girls, muttered that he had, of course, heard that women would be coming, but one of them looked far too young. Robert looked at his niece with a slight smile and calmly explained that it was all true. This was his niece, Sarah Grantchester. The other girl was Lady Rebecca, the daughter of Viscount Olson, and also Sarah's governess. The first official, pale as a ghost, apparently from days of overexertion, muttered that Rebecca was more or less understandable. But what about the niece? Would she even be able to read the documents? Robert laughed, closed his eyes, and casually remarked that the two of them shouldn't worry. Perhaps the girl would turn out to be more capable than they were themselves. The two officials exchanged glances and sighed in displeasure. Then, barely lowering their voices, they began discussing something among themselves. Sarah watched the two men and tried to figure out if she was understanding correctly what they were talking about. Most likely something like this. They'd been told a fully trained assistant would arrive. There'd been no mention of a child at all. They had neither the time nor the energy to teach someone from scratch. Fine, if she learns, so be it. But if after a few days of work she says it's not working out and leaves, that would be a real disaster. She remembered something similar from her past life. The same faces of people driven by deadlines, the same silent irritation toward a newcomer who had appeared for reasons unknown. She understood these officials perfectly well. Without looking at the three men, the girl frowned slightly and thought resolutely. No, this was exactly the job she had in mind. A new item immediately appeared on her to-do list, to be accepted into the team. Rebecca watched her charge in surprise. The girl stood perfectly straight, her face focused and unexpectedly grown up. The governess clearly didn't fully understand what exactly was going on in the girl's head, but something was happening. That much was obvious. To herself, Sarah briefly replayed a recent lesson, the curtsy. Chin down, shoulders back, grace to the tips of her fingers. Then she took a deep breath and stepped forward. Both officials looked up. The girl smoothly curtsied, bowed her head, closed her eyes, and folded her hands exactly as Rebecca had taught her, and introduced herself in a steady voice. Sarah Grantchester. She understands that her presence here may raise doubts. She asks that, if only for her uncle's sake, they treat this with understanding. Silence hung in the room for a few seconds. The officials exchanged grim glances, but differently than a minute ago. Then one of them nodded to the other, and both asked Lady Sarah to lift her head and take a seat. One even pulled out a chair to make it easier for the girl to reach. Sarah straightened up and looked around. Now, standing right in the middle of the office, she finally got a good look at the men and winced inwardly. Judging by their faces, one could assume they hadn't slept for 3 days, if not longer. She thought they looked as if they were about to die right there at their desks. And she chose not to think about those days from her past life when she herself had looked much the same. She flashed a determined look and pressed her lips together. She wanted to help these people. Truly. And then she slowly scanned the entire room. And in a panic, she thought, honestly, why are there so many papers here? The item, be accepted into the team, could be considered accomplished. Next on the list was promote the work and help the officials. Sarah sat at the table, a pile of papers stacked before her, a small water jug standing nearby, and several candles burning, to make it easier to read the writing. She looked around, waved her hand, and asked them to start by explaining the current situation. The official Benjamin picked up a quill and thought to himself with displeasure. Viscountess Rebecca was one thing. But did Lord Robert seriously believe that a young lady from the House of Grantchester, and a child at that, could be of any help to them? He exchanged a heavy glance with his colleague across from him and sighed deeply. And he muttered that this room contained records of wheat stocks, copies of reports submitted to the Royal Chancellery, starting with the routine audit 6 years ago and up to the present day, as well as documents on other sectors: agriculture, forestry, trade, crafts, and mining. Sarah asked seriously, were there any discrepancies in the figures? Benjamin frowned slightly and replied tensely that since the scheduled audit, there had been almost no discrepancies, but in the reports from 3 years ago, they were already quite serious. Meanwhile, the girl picked up one of the sheets, stood up, and began to slowly walk around the table. She paused for a few moments, looked at the employees, and apologized for asking such a basic question, but still clarified, "On what basis is the state tax calculated?" Benjamin was visibly surprised, stammered slightly, and replied, 30% of the profit. The girl pored over the papers once more and clarified, "Profit is income minus necessary expenses." Is she understanding this correctly? At that moment, a second official, James, spoke up. He nodded in agreement, stumbling slightly. To himself, he looked at their lord's serious niece and thought, could she really understand any of this? It was hard to believe. Sarah began flipping through the ledgers, and with every page, her face grew darker. Finally, she looked up and said she had 2 questions. The first, what is the deadline for filing the tax return and paying the tax for the current period? Benjamin frowned and replied that it was in about 6 months. The girl pursed her lips in displeasure and asked, will they make it in time? The official muttered that if they kept up at this pace, they wouldn't stand a chance. Sarah paused for a second and asked, wouldn't it make sense to set priorities right away? First, sort out the documents for the current period and leave the rest for later. Benjamin nodded and muttered that the girl was, of course, right, but they couldn't even manage to sort through the papers. The main character raised her hand and held up 2 fingers. She nodded in agreement and said that this raised a second question. Shouldn't all these documents follow a standard template? The letter formats vary from place to place. It's extremely inconvenient to check them. Some lack a header, while others somehow end up with what looks like a farewell note tacked on at the end. The officials exchanged glances and frowned. That was absolutely true. That was precisely one of the main problems. James, recalling the situation, muttered that they had tried to introduce a standard format, but many insisted that they couldn't deviate from the method they'd been taught at the academy. Benjamin agreed and added that every professor promoted their own system, and now factions had practically formed among the officials. Sarah muttered almost to herself that this was all utter nonsense. Benjamin raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked for an apology. Had he not heard what the lady had said? The girl shook her head, straightened up, and repeated much louder. She meant to say that a standardized document format needed to be approved immediately. Easier said than done, that much was clear. But since they work at Grantchester, those who refuse to comply with the approved format must be prepared to be fired. She proposes to announce this officially. As she spoke those last words, Sarah looked impeccably serious. Her entire petite figure, her hands folded on the table, and her steady, unblinking gaze involuntarily inspired, if not awe, then at least respect. Benjamin jumped up from his seat and exclaimed that they couldn't act so harshly. Sarah calmly frowned and explained that efficiency was too low as things stood. If they improved it, they would be able to manage with fewer people. And if a few people were fired after all, the rest would understand that this was serious. Robert remained silent, looking at his niece with undisguised surprise. She was saying truly intelligent things, and it was somewhat disconcerting. Then Sarah turned directly to him and asked if he could do everything she had mentioned. The man muttered, slightly flustered, that, well, he thought it was entirely possible. The officials exchanged glances. Everything worked out much more easily than they had expected. At that, Sarah's face brightened slightly, as if a serious, focused air had lifted from her, and she became an ordinary girl again. She cheerfully said that, to start with, they should temporarily stop making entries in the ledgers and all work together to sort through the documents. Both officials, James and Benjamin, jumped up from their seats at once and nodded. Almost simultaneously, they both thought to themselves that perhaps, if they followed Lady Sarah's lead, they might actually accomplish something. They immediately moved closer to the girl and began discussing something heatedly with her. Meanwhile, Rebecca quietly walked over to Robert. He muttered that he hadn't expected things to turn out this way. The girl folded her hands in front of her and said with a gracious smile that Sarah had completely taken the initiative. Robert watched his niece, how she was explaining something to the seasoned officials, how they were listening intently. And he thought to himself that she might just be capable of outdoing him. And that was putting it mildly. After a while, Sarah raised her hand and announced enthusiastically that they would proceed according to the following plan. First stage, reviewing the documents. Second, sorting. Some papers would not be entered into the ledgers, while others required entry, and Rebecca would handle that. The next level of sorting would be whether the documents were from the current period or not, and then by year. Benjamin would sort the documents from the current period separately, by category and by month. The girl suddenly fell silent mid-sentence, furrowing her brow, and she muttered that something didn't add up. She stared into space for a second, then waved her hand and turned to her uncle. They were short-handed. She suggested calling the butlers from the mansion. Let them at least help with simple tasks. The officials and Lord Robert exclaimed in unison, surprised. How is that even possible? Noticing the men's displeasure, Sarah calmly explained that the manager and the butler fully understand the paperwork system. They'll get up to speed quickly. Besides, they could call on the maids, who are good readers. The officials exchanged glances and laughed. James narrowed his eyes and asked the girl for forgiveness with a smirk. But women who hadn't been trained at the academy, how could they possibly help? This isn't cooking or cleaning. Lord Robert laughed even louder and said that his niece had clearly gone too far with the maids. For a second, the room filled with laughter, light, almost good-natured. Sarah moved to a chair on the other side of the table, folded her hands calmly, and bowed her head. In an even voice, she said that in that case, she asked that no task be assigned to either her or Lady Rebecca. Robert saw his niece's face take on that very same impassive, stony expression he had come to recognize over the past few days, and he awkwardly rubbed his cheek with his index finger, muttering something indistinct under his breath. The girl showed no reaction to this. Frowning, she added that she was merely suggesting that the work be entrusted to those capable of carrying it out. She had no intention of wasting time on pointless arguments over trifles. At that moment, both officials rushed up to Robert from either side and whispered, almost competing with each other, that he had finally managed to anger Lady Sarah, and that it would probably be best to do as she said. The main character's uncle looked at his niece, then at the officials, then back at his niece, and with a slight air of embarrassment, waved his hand. Agreed. He would see to it. To herself, Sarah, however, wasn't angry at anyone. It was just that in her past life, when she went into work mode, her emotions almost never showed on her face, and her colleagues always thought she was angry about something or dissatisfied with someone. She had to explain that she wasn't. In fact, that was her usual state of mind at work. Soon, butlers and maids began to file into the office. A little bewildered, clearly not understanding why they had been summoned to this place, steeped in the scent of candle wax and old paper. But their confusion quickly passed. Everyone was assigned tasks and put to work without delay. Benjamin and James sorted through their stacks of documents without looking up. The maids and butlers bustled nearby, collecting already checked sheets, bringing new stacks. They arranged light refreshments at the edges of the tables and made sure the inkwells didn't run dry and the candles were changed on time. The study, which until recently had resembled a battlefield, was beginning to take on a semblance of order. Late evening had fallen. It had long since grown dark outside. The candles burned steadily, and a focused silence hung in the room, broken only by the rustle of paper and the scratch of quills. Rebecca rose from her seat and calmly, yet without room for objection, announced that it was time for Lady Sarah to rest. She allowed her to stay until the start of her free time, but lights out was strictly on schedule. No exceptions. The girl rose from the table, muttering to herself in displeasure that the governess was, after all, unbearably serious, not a shred of flexibility. Aloud, however, she said only that she agreed and began to gather her things. She stopped just as she reached the door and turned around. She looked at her uncle and asked, maybe it was time for him and the officials to call a day, too? Robert looked up, smiled wearily, and waved his hand. They wouldn't get anything done that way. There was still enough work for several more evenings like this. Sarah frowned. Her voice grew slightly softer, but firmer. She said, isn't it because of the daily overtime that the officials have been dropping like flies one after another over the past 2 years? If they kept this up, Mr. James and Mr. Benjamin would collapse at some point too, and they'd be lucky if it was just from exhaustion. There's a long road ahead, and it's far wiser to work steadily without overexerting oneself. In the end, it will be more effective. She's certain of that. Both officials covered their faces with their hands, almost in unison. They were silent for a few seconds, and then stared at Lady Sarah with undisguised admiration. The girl, unaware of the effect she had made, paused briefly and added that perhaps it was presumptuous for a child like her to say such things. Robert gently interrupted her and asked with a smile, why remind everyone again that you're a child? Sarah shrugged and replied, quite seriously, that she really was only 8 years old. It was simply a fact. The officials exchanged glances, and they all jumped to their feet at once. Benjamin asked in shock, is Lady Sarah really 8 years old? His voice sounded as if he had expected to hear something else. Then, clearly not fully believing his own words, he added that he had thought the girl was hiding a fairy's blessing. Her age just didn't fit with what she said and did. Sarah readily nodded at the first suggestion, but at the second she laughed softly and apologized. What did he mean she didn't look her age? She's just an ordinary 8-year-old girl. To herself, she thought awkwardly. Well, she couldn't very well say that inside she was older than all of them, that she had actually been reborn and had a completely different life behind her, a different job, different deadlines. Some things are better left unsaid. Forever. The next day, from early morning, an unusual, almost surprising order reigned in the office. Maids bustled about everywhere, in unison, without unnecessary noise. One of them whispered to her friend that she had always considered the office strictly male territory and couldn't have imagined that she'd ever end up here on business. Now, however, they were in charge of the schedule. They provided the gentleman with the necessary plans and reports on time and carried documents from desk to desk. We restocked supplies of pens and ink. We brought tea and light snacks. We monitored work progress and adjusted schedules. We checked spelling and letters and assisted with correspondence. We tidied up the desks and, upon request, gave shoulder massages to the overworked officials, who were initially embarrassed but eventually got used to it. By the end of the first day, Lord Robert, James, and Benjamin had come to a unanimous and somewhat disconcerting conclusion. Having maids in the office was actually wonderful. How had they ever managed without this before? 3 days later, both officials leaned back in their chairs at the same time, and almost simultaneously, in unison, let out a sigh. Finally, the sorting of documents for the current period was complete. Everyone present clapped. A little later, everyone gathered in a small break room. The maids were chatting among themselves in the corner, clearly pleased. Robert and Rebecca sat at the head table with the officials next to them, and Sarah sat among them all, a mug of grape juice in her hands. The girl sipped her juice discontentedly and muttered to herself that this was supposed to be a celebration, but she was still going to leave before everyone else. Sleep came first. Incidentally, it was precisely after these events that a special unit of maids appeared at the Grantchester Administrative Building, essentially the first real secretariat. The position quickly became one of the most coveted for women in the district. Over time, the system spread to other estates, and a few years later, a special training school was opened, and the profession finally established itself as a fully fledged career path for women. No one could have imagined back then that the financial crisis in the Grantchester lands would spark the emergence of an entirely new profession. Sarah herself hadn't thought about that yet. Her thoughts had drifted slightly. She was pondering how greeting officials every morning with "Welcome back, sir" surely boosted their motivation. A small thing, but a pleasant one. People work better when they feel they're expected. In her to-do list, the item sort through documents was finally marked as completed. Immediately, a new one took its place: sort out the accounting books. The next morning, there was a lesson on the tax system. Rebecca was busy helping Robert this time, so Benjamin stepped in as the lecturer. He explained the general framework. Residents pay taxes to the Lord, and the Lord pays them to the state. The guilds handle the actual collection, each in their own sector. There is no banking system in this world, but guilds associated with trading houses often use promissory notes. That is, residents pay taxes to the guild, which then sells or receives promissory notes to the trading houses. In addition, the guild's responsibilities include compiling a list of residents, keeping records of income and expenses, and issuing payment receipts. The guild then pays the tax to the Lord, who distributes the funds. Sarah listened and asked in surprise, "So the estate doesn't manage this directly?" Benjamin sighed and explained that taxes aren't paid solely in cash. So cashing out these funds and calculating the amounts are also part of the guild's responsibilities. The girl raised her hand and clarified, "Does that mean the estate's officials receive reports from the guild and process them themselves?" Benjamin nodded with satisfaction that she was a quick learner, but added that agriculture was an exception. The estate managed that directly, without the guild's involvement. The main character froze thoughtfully for a couple of moments. So, the former administrators were pulling off their schemes precisely at these stages, and they surely had accomplices among the guild members. Otherwise, there was no way to explain how all this had gone on for so long. A little later that same day, Sarah and Rebecca went to the administrative building to continue their work. Almost at the very entrance, Robert met them, greeted his niece, and introduced the two people standing behind him. The officials, who had been laid up from exhaustion, had finally returned. Pollux, the agriculture official, introduced himself, gave the girl a friendly look, and said he was pleased to meet the young lady. Standing next to him was Castor, the official in charge of trade and crafts. He placed his hand over his heart and, with sincere warmth in his voice, said that they had heard that this very girl had become their savior. Both added, almost in unison, that from now on they too would devote all their efforts to the work and were counting on her cooperation. A little later, everyone gathered in Robert's office. Sarah stepped forward, folded her hands on the table, and said that they should begin keeping the books for the current period. And she had a suggestion: double-entry bookkeeping. Single-entry bookkeeping records only income or expenses. Double-entry bookkeeping records each transaction as both a debit and a credit simultaneously. The officials and Robert exchanged surprised glances and asked almost in unison, "What is double-entry bookkeeping?" Sarah folded her arms across her chest in displeasure and noted to herself that while she was sorting through the papers, she had already suspected that no one in this world had heard of double-entry bookkeeping. She straightened up, placed her hands on the table, and explained that the current books, with their simple entries, weren't bad in and of themselves. But to uncover past fraud and prevent new ones, a double entry system was far more suitable. To herself, she grimaced almost in panic, thinking that, to be honest, she would have preferred accounting software, or at least spreadsheets. But what isn't there, isn't there. She smiled aloud, clasped her hands in front of her, and added that, in other words, if this system were implemented, the work would become much more efficient. The officials looked at her with rapt attention, clearly ready to listen further. Then Sarah, with a completely impassive expression and a slight twinkle in her eyes, remarked that the system was a bit more complicated than the previous one. But for them, elite officials, that was clearly no problem. At this subtle flattery, the officials began to feel flattered and hastened to assure her that, of course, they would handle it perfectly well. Without the slightest difficulty, Sarah handed the men several prepared documents and asked them to review the materials and familiarize themselves with them. The next item on the agenda, implementing double-entry bookkeeping, had been completed. A little later, sitting at one of the tables, James quietly told his partner that thanks to the system proposed by Lady Sarah, the financial situation had become much clearer. Benjamin nodded and said they should get to work properly. At first, both worked with light smiles and palpable enthusiasm. But gradually their faces grew somber, slowly, page by page, figure by figure. By the end, they could barely contain something resembling quiet horror. A week later, Sarah walked into the office and thanked everyone for their hard work. However, she immediately noticed that all the men looked a bit strange. Tense. She asked aloud in surprise, why was the atmosphere so heavy? The officials bowed their heads and hesitated to answer. They looked dejected, like people who know something unpleasant but don't know where to start. Robert spoke up. He turned to his niece and said that they had discovered something frightening. He frowned deeply, rubbed his forehead wearily, and added that they should sort things out step by step. He turned to the officials and asked, what is the total amount of the promissory notes issued by the Grantchester estate? They replied, $150,000. Sarah instantly began calculating in her head. $1 is roughly equal to 10,000 yen. That means promissory notes worth about 1.5 billion yen have been issued. Impressive. Robert continued, how many promissory notes does the estate currently hold? The answer, $80,000. Then he asked how much cash. Another official replied that there was just over 50,000. Sarah snorted to herself and quickly did the math. The shortfall was $20,000. That means they're in the red by about 200 million yen. This is more than just a minor inconvenience. James quietly added that if the promissory notes were presented for cashing at the same time, it would be a disaster. As he said this, he turned noticeably pale. Sarah walked over to him and asked, what will happen if they can't pay it off? The official leaned slightly toward the girl and listed the consequences grimly. Sanctions against the noble house, a 2-year ban on issuing promissory notes, a public announcement of default, and a loss of trust. A blow to their reputation from which it would take years to recover. Lord Robert clasped his hands in front of him, lowered his head onto them, and exhaled heavily. The men frowned, rubbed their foreheads, and tried to hide their faces, each in his own way, but with the same result. Sarah sighed, watching this scene, and muttered to herself that no matter how you looked at it, Grantchester was now up to its ears in debt. She slowly rubbed her temple, trying to process everything she'd heard, and repeated to herself that this couldn't be true. It just couldn't be. But the numbers told a different story, and arguing with them was pointless. To avoid defaulting on the promissory notes, they urgently needed to get their hands on either cash or new promissory notes. A new item immediately appeared on her to-do list. Come up with ways to obtain cash or promissory notes. Without waiting for his niece to say anything, Lord Robert grabbed a quill, pulled a sheet of paper toward him, and began muttering that he needed to write to his father immediately. Perhaps they would have to sell part of the Grantchester treasures. His voice was almost panicked. His thoughts were clearly racing ahead of his words. He continued, though his father might consider it a disgrace and refuse. Or perhaps he should ask the trading houses to hold off on cashing the promissory notes. His hand moved across the paper of its own accord. His eyes clouded over, and he looked like a man trying to plug a hole in a ship with his bare hands. Sarah looked at him, a grown man, a lord, a landowner, and saw a man drowning. The pause dragged on. She called out to him loudly, Uncle, you mustn't do this under any circumstances. If they reveal their predicament too soon, things won't get better. They'll only get worse. With those words, the girl jumped closer to Robert to look more convincing. He looked up at her, bags under his eyes, his face gray with fatigue, but still nodded slowly in agreement. Sarah froze for a second, gathering her thoughts. Then she asked, had the treasures been stolen as well? Robert shook his head. Everything stored in the Grantchester treasury had survived. The girl nodded in agreement, paused for a couple of moments, thoughtfully taking in the situation. And then she waved her hand. She said instructively that selling the treasures should only be done as a last resort. It should be the final step when there is absolutely no other option left. The men asked in unison, why did she think that? Sarah raised her hand, frowned slightly, and explained that treasures were treasures. Selling them could not be hidden from the other houses. If you sell openly, that's fine. You can explain it in various ways. But if there's no convincing explanation for why you suddenly needed money, it will look as though something has happened, and it could lead to the embezzlement case being exposed. As she spoke those last words, she frowned deeply, conveying both fear and gravity at the same time. For a few seconds, no one in the room moved. Robert listened to her, staring blankly at the sheet of paper on which he had already managed to write a few lines. Then, slowly and methodically, he began to cross everything out, line by line, without rushing. A silence fell over the room, a lingering, unpleasant one. Castor, the official in charge of trade and crafts, cautiously suggested that perhaps they could sell part of their reserves. For example, wheat. What did those present think of the idea? Pollux, the agriculture official, waved his hands in denial, furiously, almost in fear. No, that's impossible. Reserves of grain, ore, and other goods are now less than half of the norm. The situation is particularly dire with wheat. If there's a major crop failure, they might not even survive the winter. The words fell into the silence like stones. After that, a dark, oppressive silence settled in. The kind where it's especially unpleasant to think because you have to think about the bad. In Sarah's plan, in addition to the item about cash and promissory notes, another one immediately appeared, to come up with ways to increase grain reserves, specifically wheat. She mentally distanced herself from the conversation, bowed her head, and thought that the problems had only multiplied. Then Rebecca spoke up. She folded her hands in front of her, sat up straight, and calmly said that the situation was difficult. That was true, but there was no famine yet. They would pray for a bountiful harvest and gradually get everything back to normal. After hearing this, Robert sat up straight in his chair and said firmly that this was probably the only realistic course of action. Off to the side, Pollux muttered quietly, frowning, as if talking almost to himself. We need to increase not only our cash reserves, but also our wheat stocks. He sat up straight and suggested aloud that, while reducing the volume of wheat sold outside the domain wouldn't solve the cash flow problem, it would allow them to gradually replenish their reserves. The officials exchanged silent glances and nodded slightly, considering it a possible option. But Sarah jerked her head up. No, she said, it's better to avoid even that. When asked why, she replied briefly, for the same reason, they could be exposed. Grantchester is one of the main suppliers of wheat to the market. If volumes are sharply reduced, grain prices in the country will skyrocket, and the market will be thrown into turmoil. She seriously doubted that the royal court would ignore this. An investigation was highly likely to determine the reason for the reduction in supplies. As she spoke, she frowned so intensely that the room grew noticeably quieter once more. Everyone thought intently. What then could possibly be done? Sarah mentally sorted through the situation. Above all, the other houses must not find out about the thefts. We need to increase our grain reserves without attracting the attention of the crown and the aristocracy. And, at the same time, we need to somehow increase our cash reserves. But we can't sell Grantchester's treasures. They might be discovered. We can't sell the estate's reserves. There are already catastrophically few of them. We can't reduce wheat shipments outside the estate. That might also be discovered. The circle was closed. All obvious paths were cut off. And then it suddenly dawned on her. Something clicked, and she jerked her head up, and she asked her uncle. After all, supplies don't necessarily have to be stored in the estate's barns, do they? If, in the event of a famine, it's enough to simply open the warehouses, then they don't necessarily have to formally belong to the estate. Was she understanding this correctly? Robert raised his eyebrows in surprise, looking at his niece, who had suddenly come to life. Just a second ago, she had been sitting quietly, and now there was clearly a spark in her eyes. He chuckled and asked what exactly she meant. The girl smiled mysteriously. She looked at her uncle and, slowly and deliberately, and suggested, what if they started a trading company? After those words, all the adults in the room stared at her in silence, some with surprise, some with confusion, some with cautious interest that hadn't yet decided where it would lead. But all at once, and all of them, without looking away, a new item appeared on Sarah's list, start a trading company. At these words, Robert froze in confusion, his gaze fixed on his niece, and asked uncertainly, you mean start a completely new one, from scratch with nothing to our name, but an idea? Sarah eagerly reached for a fountain pen, and, already pulling a blank sheet of paper toward her, muttered that she would explain everything in order. The pen glided swiftly across the paper, sketching out a diagram. Lines, arrows, brief notes in the margins. She spoke without taking her eyes off the drawing. The main problem was that wheat reserves were catastrophically low, and if they acted carelessly, the crown would become suspicious immediately. This is where the trading company would come in handy. They'll keep the amount of grain going into the granaries the same, no more, no less. Shipments outside the domain will be cut to a minimum, just enough to avoid disrupting the market and drawing unnecessary attention. All the remaining grain will be sold to the new company. Local merchants will buy exactly as much as they need from this company, and if a famine should suddenly strike, the company's warehouses will simply open to the residents, and no one will be able to find fault with it. Rebecca listened in silence, thoughtfully propping her head up with her hand, and slowly said that she seemed to understand that the grain would formally be sold to the company, but in reality, the estate would increase its own reserves without drawing anyone's attention. Sarah smiled conspiratorially, winked at those present, and added that, if necessary, the company would simply transfer the grain to the residents on humanitarian grounds. And once the financial issue was finally resolved, they would officially buy the reserves back. Everything clean, everything legal, no unnecessary questions. Robert was silent for a few seconds, staring at a single point and clearly running the plan through his head. Then he chuckled quietly, rose from his chair, and said animatedly that it was a sensible plan and he would definitely discuss everything with his father. Under the heading Establish a Trading Company, an additional sub-item immediately appeared, Coordinate with the Marquis. Sarah froze, and a faint shadow flitted across her face. The thought that wouldn't leave her mind hadn't gone anywhere. The plan was sound, but it still wouldn't increase the total volume of wheat. If frost or drought struck this year, no trading company would save the situation. She mentally snapped herself out of it. For starters, they needed to do what was within their power, and that would already be quite a lot. Glancing over the papers, she quickly scanned the list. Wheat, legumes, straw, woolen blankets. There was a shortage everywhere, and the first thing to do was to buy everything necessary, filling at least the minimum volume. She mentally checked off the item about checking supplies, and immediately another one followed, purchasing the necessary resources. And for that, she needed cash, which meant yet another item, finding a way to get it. After a few moments of silence, pondering her options, Sarah looked up and asked her uncle aloud, maybe they should start logging on the estate? Robert shook his head dejectedly and muttered that the great forest was home to powerful magical beasts, and that developing a logging operation there was extremely difficult, almost impossible, and if only it were feasible, he would have done so long ago. Having finished speaking, he sank heavily back into his chair, clasped his head in his hands, and, with undisguised anxiety in his voice, began to say that the Grantchester estate was the most populous in the country, and finding themselves in such a situation was simply unthinkable. The officials immediately rushed to him from both sides and began vying with one another to assure him that it was nothing to worry about, that as soon as the harvest was over, things would become much easier, while others chimed in that everything was fine and they would pray for a bountiful harvest. Sarah remained standing opposite them, and Rebecca quietly approached her, glancing through some documents as she walked. The girl looked at the grown men, who were behaving in a completely unadult manner, and something tightened inside her, not out of pity, but out of a sharp, almost physical impatience. She declared loudly that, no matter how you looked at it, relying solely on the harvest when both supplies and cash were running out was too risky. Frowning, she added that, on top of that, they still had to uncover past accounting fraud. And if it turned out that taxes had been deliberately underreported, they would have to pay the entire shortfall at once. And she would very much like to know, were the officials certain they would be able to pay the full amount without delay at that moment? With that, she began to approach slowly, and something about her demeanor, her straight back, her quiet, steady voice, the way she looked at each person in turn, made people involuntarily sit up straight and fall silent. Robert opened his mouth to reply, and couldn't. The words wouldn't come, and he remained sitting there with the bewildered expression of a man who had just been neatly, but very convincingly pinned against the wall. Then Sarah stated clearly and without any unnecessary inflection that the face value of the issued promissory notes already exceeded the estate's assets, and that the reserves were catastrophically low, and in their position, they were obliged to acknowledge the fact that Grantchester was on the brink of bankruptcy. The officials clearly paled, fell silent for several long seconds, and then, one after another, began to agree quietly, looking utterly stunned, as if someone had finally spoken aloud what everyone had long thought but carefully avoided saying. Then Rebecca quietly approached Sarah and crouched down slightly, and whispered that if they accepted the fact that the Crown and the other houses would find out everything, solving the problem would actually be easier, wouldn't it? Sarah nodded, just as quietly, and replied that technically, yes, that was indeed possible. But the officials are too complacent. Some say they'll get out of it by selling Grantchester's treasures. Others are sure that taking the wheat will be enough, and everything will sort itself out, and none of them truly understand yet how serious the situation is. Furrowing her brow slightly and pursing her lips, she added very quietly that they needed to feel it at least a little on their own skin, otherwise they would just keep reassuring each other until it was too late. In Sarah's plan, under the heading Develop Sources of Income Other Than Wheat and Reduce Dependence on It, a new line appeared, Find a Way to Get Cash Quickly. She turned to Pollux and asked if they had any special products that weren't included in the mandatory reserves. The man leaned toward her slightly, shrugged, and muttered that Elmo was probably a fruit, so it wasn't included in the reserves. It was very similar to an apple and quite popular in the capital. Every year, the best fruits are sent as a gift to the royal family, while the rest are processed and sold, made into jam and juice. Robert suddenly interrupted the conversation, remembering that there was also Elmo wine, simple, tasty, for people of modest means. At these words, Sarah's eyes sparkled slightly, because the word wine had always held a special place in her personal vocabulary. In her past life, she had been a devoted fan of it. Robert, not noticing his niece's reaction, continued, saying that they had once tried to sell Elmo wine in the capital, but the bottles often exploded, so they eventually abandoned the idea. Sarah froze thoughtfully for a couple of seconds, rested her hand on her chin, and asked, how on earth could they explode? Could it be carbonated? No one had time to answer, because at that moment a bell rang, signaling the end of the workday. A little later, in the break room, on the table in front of the main character, stood a glass filled with Elmo wine. Sarah clasped her hands together, gazed at it with sparkling eyes, and murmured that it looked just like cider and seemed irresistibly delicious, her whole demeanor expressing a keen desire to taste it immediately. Robert smiled awkwardly and said she couldn't have any yet. Sarah understood this herself. Elmo wine, essentially apple wine, releases carbon dioxide when fermented in an airtight container, which increases the internal pressure and dissolves into the drink, making it sparkling. But wooden barrels aren't completely airtight, so the carbonation is usually weak. She gazed thoughtfully at the rising bubbles and thought that if the storage had been improper, it was no surprise that the bottles hadn't held up. And then it suddenly dawned on her. What if they carried out secondary fermentation right in the bottle, like with champagne? Pollux sat down next to her, and the girl, waving her hand, said that the problem was most likely the strength of the bottles and the storage conditions, and if strict quality control were established, it might very well work out. The official shrugged slightly, muttering something about the cost of sturdy bottles. Then, grimacing, he added that good ones were very expensive. Just then, Castor approached them and, furrowing his brow, remarked that Elmo wine was a drink for common folk, and if the price went up, they simply wouldn't be able to afford it. Sarah smiled conspiratorially, put a finger to her lips, and explained that it was only considered common here in the domain, but since people in other lands had barely heard of it, they could instead play up its rarity. Then she raised her finger and added about the bottles. What if we introduced a return system, took back the empties, and offered a discount on the next purchase? That would attract regular customers and, at the same time, solve the issue of packaging costs. Upon hearing this idea, the officials exchanged glances and began nodding vigorously. It was truly a well-thought-out plan. The plan's item come up with a use for Elmo wine had been completed, but a new one immediately arose. To discuss all this with the trading houses, Sarah tapped her finger thoughtfully against her glass a couple of times, watching the bubbles, and asked, "Isn't Elmo wine distilled?" Pollux asked her to clarify. Did she really mean the method alchemists use to make their potions? At the word alchemists, the girl froze in surprise. So, in this world, distillation is monopolized by alchemists. She gasped inwardly, realizing what that meant. There was essentially no hard liquor here. No one had any. The next second, she jumped up from her seat and practically rushed toward her uncle. Inside, she was literally boiling with excitement. This was a real opportunity, a living, unoccupied niche, and to let it slip by would be a true crime. Jumping up to Robert, she immediately said she wanted to meet with the alchemist. Her uncle stumbled slightly and asked in bewilderment, "Why?" Sarah smiled and explained that an idea had come to her. She wasn't sure if it would work, but she suggested trying to distill Elmo wine and create a completely new drink, saying this with a smile and at the same time with such a serious expression that both impressions strangely coexisted. Robert's eyes widened, and he asked, "What do you mean, distill wine?" Sarah frowned slightly, waved her hands with an air of complete innocence, and explained that since they had Elma, they needed to make the most of it. There are currently problems with transportation and storage, which make it impossible to distribute the product to a wide audience, and she wants to solve this problem. Robert gasped and asked with undisguised astonishment, "Do you really think distillation will help with that?" Sarah clenched her fist resolutely and replied that she wouldn't know until she tried, but it was definitely worth a try. To herself, She added that all of this was for the sake of saving the estate's finances, for the sake of Grantchester. But her thoughts had already begun to drift quietly in another direction, because somewhere deep down there lived a woman who sincerely and unconditionally loved good Calvados, and that woman was now quietly rejoicing. Strictly speaking, it wouldn't be Calvados, it would be Elma Brandy. But did that really change anything fundamental? The blood of a drink lover was literally boiling inside her, and she didn't even notice how she'd started to bounce slightly on the spot, beaming with such undisguised anticipation that all the adults around her stared at her with equally puzzled expressions. New items appeared on the agenda. Develop Elma Brandy, for which she must first meet with the alchemist and continue searching for new sources of income. Because, with all due respect to the drink, brandy alone cannot save Grantchester from its financial crisis. Grantchester had long been one of the finest grain-producing estates in the entire country, and that was precisely why everything here revolved around agriculture. Trade and crafts always took a back seat. That was just the way things were, and no one really questioned whether it was normal at all. The main character, meanwhile, suggested approaching the issue differently. They needed to develop other sources of income and gradually reduce their dependence on wheat, and to start with, they should figure out, did they even have any special goods besides grain? Behind the girl, with his back turned to her, sat Castor, the official in charge of trade and crafts. Upon hearing these words, he jumped up at once and exclaimed that of course they did, his eyes sparkling and his whole demeanor expressing the impatience of a man who had long awaited such a conversation. He asked, "What about magic stones?" And to himself at that moment, he thought that if they could finally truly develop the trade sector, his department would no longer be viewed as something secondary. Having calmed down a bit and clearly passionate about his topic, he continued, saying that a few years ago they had found a mine where they extract very high-quality magic stones. The volumes are still small, but they could consider expanding production. Robert thoughtfully rested his elbow on the table, rubbed the bridge of his nose with his finger, and muttered that it sounded good. However, production is currently too low, and there's a danger zone near the mine due to the monsters in the area, and if you factor in the risks when calculating actual profits, it all looks rather dubious. At these words, Castor turned pale and gloomy, once again watching his ideas fail to gain support. That's when Sarah stepped in and, apologizing for her ignorance, asked her uncle a question. What exactly are magic stones? Robert frowned slightly, paled for a second, and muttered that when his niece said she didn't understand something, for some reason he immediately felt embarrassed for himself. Then he suggested she sit closer. However, it was Rebecca who took on the task of explaining, in a soft, gentle voice, as if this were an ordinary lesson in the gazebo rather than an urgent meeting about the financial crisis. It turned out that magic stones are stones within which mana is concentrated, and even a person completely devoid of magical power could use them with this. Rebecca explained that in this world, everything is unevenly distributed. Some people have a lot of mana, while others have none at all. For example, a firestone can be used as an eternal source of flame. Sarah raised her eyebrows and thought that this was indeed very convenient. Rebecca smiled, closed her eyes, and calmly added that when the magic in the stone runs out, it becomes an ordinary stone. After hearing this, the girl's expression changed slightly, and she noted to herself that it was, after all, just a consumable. Then she asked if magic stones were expensive. Rebecca explained that it all depended on the quality and amount of mana inside. The cheapest stones, small, low-quality ones, are mainly intended for ordinary people and used for everyday needs. A slightly higher grade consists of stones that allow for the casting of weak spells like a fireball, but even these deplete rather quickly. Higher quality stones can be used several times, while the most expensive and largest ones are true rarities capable of withstanding powerful spells like hellfire, and in terms of value, they are considered national treasures. After all this, Robert nodded and added that this is precisely why stones are so highly valued everywhere. But the area around that mine is full of beasts and monsters, making it extremely dangerous. And if we're thinking about expanding production, we need to resolve this issue first. Castor lowered his head again, his whole demeanor betraying the despondency of a man accustomed to seeing his ideas dashed against others' skepticism. As usual, nothing would come of it. Sarah intervened again and turned to her uncle, saying that as soon as the opportunity arose, they absolutely had to pursue this line of inquiry. Robert, looking at his niece, couldn't refuse and nodded in agreement. At these words, Castor's spirits lifted. He thought to himself that Lady Sarah was the most wonderful person. Out loud, he thanked everyone and urged them to try to get started on this as soon as possible, because it wasn't just about the stones. He added, lowering his voice, that excellent medicinal herbs grew near the mine, and poor women and children often went there to gather them, risking their lives because of the monsters in the area. Hearing this, Sarah froze with the cup raised to her lips and simply held it there for a few seconds, not moving. Then she slowly lowered it and asked again, what kind of herbs exactly was he talking about? And she clarified. So near the mine, one can extract not only magic stones but also medicinal herbs, and one's valuable enough that people go there despite the danger. At these words, Castor visibly perked up and began nodding in agreement. Sarah turned to her uncle and asked if he knew about this. Robert shook his head, closing his eyes, and replied that no, he didn't know. Robert closed his eyes and continued, saying that gathering herbs was a menial side job for ordinary people, not something a lord should be doing. At these words, the main character jumped up from her seat and exclaimed furiously, what on earth is he talking about? People risk their lives because it's one of the few ways to make a living, and these herbs are used to make medicines that save the health and lives of the estate's inhabitants. And if that doesn't need protecting, then what on earth does? Her eyes flashing with fury, she continued, saying that they needed to clear the area of monsters immediately. This would help in two ways at once, both herb gathering and magic stone mining, and there was simply no point in putting it off any longer. Falling silent, she looked at her uncle, waiting for his decision, and her entire demeanor radiated such undisguised indignation, such a completely unchildlike determination. Robert hesitated, stumbled over his words a few times, and finally said that all right, of course, he would submit an application to the Adventurers Guild. Castor had been standing slightly to the side the whole time, watching the unfolding scene with undisguised admiration, thinking to himself that in all his years of service, trade and craft issues had never been resolved so quickly and so convincingly. Lady Sarah had definitively and irrevocably become a true goddess to him. New items appeared on the main character's to-do list, expanding the extraction of magic stones, organizing the gathering of medicinal herbs, and since monsters in the area were hindering all of this, it was necessary to submit a request to the Adventurers Guild as soon as possible to clear the area. A few days later, officials were falling over themselves to tell Lady Sarah that they were already arranging meetings with representatives of the Alchemists Guild and the Adventurers Guild, and one of them asked, who did she wish to meet with first? A new item immediately appeared on the agenda, determine the composition of the meeting. The heroine froze for a few seconds, covered her mouth with her hand, widened her eyes, and asked, isn't clearing out monsters the job of the Order of Knights? James patiently explained that knights only get involved in extreme situations, when the domain faces a serious external threat, and their main task is to defend the borders, not to hunt forest creatures for the sake of the mine's safety. Sarah nodded and muttered, so even in security work, there's a clear division of responsibilities, just like in my past life, where each department zealously guarded its own area of responsibility and never interfered with another's. Suddenly it dawned on her. Her eyes lit up, and she announced that she understood everything and that everyone needed to be summoned immediately to a single joint meeting. The officials exchanged surprised glances, and they cautiously asked, what do you mean, everyone at once? After all, distilling wine and hunting monsters are absolutely unrelated. They're completely different matters and involve completely different people. The heroine dreamily closed her eyes and muttered that she wanted to ask the alchemists about medicinal herbs while she was at it. Since they were meeting anyway, why not resolve several issues at once? Benjamin raised his eyebrows slightly and cautiously pointed out that medicines in this country are made by pharmacists, not alchemists. There are different guilds with different specializations. Sarah's eyes widened as she stared at her companions in surprise, and then she turned away abruptly and let out a mental sigh. Wait a minute. How can pharmacists and alchemists be different professions? Completely different. Deep down, she was convinced that everything in this world worked much the same way as in the stories she'd read in her past life. And it seemed she'd relied too heavily on knowledge from light novels when she should have figured things out for herself. It was an annoying and slightly humiliating slip-up. Meanwhile, the officials exchanged glances and looked at the girl with such a fond expression that she felt her cheeks begin to grow warm. Sarah immediately caught herself and decided that, in any case, it would be useful to figure out who was in charge of what. She thrust her arm forward with the most menacing and resolute expression she could muster and declared that, in that case, the pharmacist should be called as well. Let them come too. The official immediately and willingly bowed and muttered that he would comply. Then the girl added that Pollux and Castor would also participate in the meeting. Their topics directly concern the mine and trade, and without them the discussion would be incomplete. The officials exchanged glances and nodded in agreement, saying that everything would be fine. Then Robert, James, and Benjamin asked almost simultaneously, with equally offended expressions, so, does that mean they aren't needed? Sarah hesitated slightly and muttered that she would gladly invite the three of them as well. But they had a mountain of work, and she didn't even know if it was okay to distract them from it for the sake of a meeting that already promised to be long. Robert sat up straight with the most determined look on his face and declared that he was absolutely certain the meeting Sarah was attending would definitely be interesting, and just the thought of it alone would prevent him from working properly anyway, so he might as well be there in person. Sarah frowned and asked, "Do I really look like that? The kind of person people drop everything to just look at?" The officials and Robert nodded in unison, and her uncle confirmed with a smile that yes, that's exactly how she looked to them, and there was nothing to be done about it. The girl frowned even more, saying with a slight and completely sincere indignation that they didn't need to agree so unanimously. It was cruel, and they could at least feign a little doubt for appearance's sake. The item determined the composition of the meeting was finally settled, and they could move on. On the day of the meeting, a maid quietly entered the room where the girls were and politely addressed them, Lady Sarah and Lady Rebecca. Everyone was already gathered and waiting only for them. The girl nodded in agreement, made a light, neat curtsy, and thanked her. After that, the maid led them through the corridors toward the hall. Just before the doors, Sarah stopped for a second. She simply stopped for no apparent reason and stood silently for a few moments. She and Rebecca exchanged glances. The governess looked at her charge with a completely tender expression, her eyes half closed, as if she already knew that something very typical of this girl was about to happen. Something both serious and a little funny. Sarah threw her head back decisively, turned toward the door, and said, "That's it. Time to go," and start the multi-professional brainstorming session. The most important part of her plan for today was exactly that, to walk into that room, gather people from completely different fields around the table, and conduct a meeting that would actually be worthwhile. She took a step forward, and the doors opened. Sarah Grantchester entered the hall with a brisk, confident stride, and the sound of her footsteps, crisp and rhythmic, echoed through the room so clearly that several people instinctively turned to look. The hall was spacious, with tall windows through which even daylight streamed, and a long table in the center, covered with a dark tablecloth. On one side of the table sat familiar faces. Robert, the steward of the Grantchester estate, next to him James and Benjamin, and a little further away, Pollux and Castor. Behind the officials, a maid stood along the wall. Sarah calmly walked to her seat and sat down, folding her hands in front of her as if she'd been attending such meetings her whole life. Rebecca settled in beside her, her lips pressed together, slightly from the nervousness she was carefully hiding. On the other side of the table sat three strangers. One of the three leaned forward slightly and, without any preamble, asked, "Who exactly are these girls sitting in front of us?" Robert didn't have a chance to answer first. Sarah had already bowed her head slightly and calmly apologized for keeping them waiting, after which her uncle, with a slight nod, introduced them both. He explained that the younger one was his niece, Sarah, and next to her was Rebecca, the daughter of Viscount Olson, the governor's wife. There was a moment of silence. Then the representative of the Alchemists Guild, Theophrastus, spoke up. He remarked casually that he'd been told the matter was urgent, but he must admit he was somewhat puzzled. Could it be that Lady Sarah simply wanted to watch? Robert frowned and said in an even voice that the opposite was true. She was the one who had called this meeting, and he and all the officials were present only as observers. The guild representatives exchanged glances. Their expressions all conveyed the same thing, distrust. Then John, the representative of the Adventurers Guild, spoke up. He said politely but firmly that he apologized, but none of them had time to entertain a child. Sarah raised her eyebrows slightly. Robert noticed this, and something inside him shifted very quietly, almost imperceptibly. His face remained completely calm, and his smile hadn't faded, but the atmosphere in the room suddenly grew heavier. Robert spoke just as calmly, saying that he had no intention of asking the esteemed guild representatives to play childish games at, but perhaps it would be wise to listen first and draw conclusions later. The atmosphere was oppressive. Rebecca turned anxiously toward Robert and said, with a hint of alarm in her voice, that something was clearly wrong with his magic. Robert blinked, and the pressure vanished immediately, as if it had never been there. He turned to his niece and, with a completely good-natured expression, apologized to everyone present. Then he turned to Sarah separately and asked quietly if she was all right. The girl looked at her uncle with a hint of surprise and thought to herself that a person with a large reserve of mana who released it outwardly, that was perceived by those around them as physical pressure. The guild representatives turned pale. All three tried hard to pretend that everything was fine, but Theophrastus's hands were trembling ever so slightly. John, after struggling to steady his breathing, dryly offered an apology on behalf of all three of them. Sarah almost admired her uncle inwardly. He hadn't uttered a single threatening word, hadn't raised his voice, and yet had achieved exactly the result he needed. She clapped her hands and said that perhaps they could begin now. Rebecca gave a slight smile, her usual calm smile. Sarah took out a map, unfolded it on the table, and moved it closer to the center so everyone could see it. Then she calmly explained that she intended to submit an application to the Adventurers Guild to clear out the monsters in the area around the mining shaft. To start with, I'd like to know if we need specific species data to fill out the form. John, who was sitting closest to the map, stood up, glanced at it, and said that, generally speaking, no, they already have a rough idea of the monsters in this area. Sarah tilted her head slightly and asked with genuine interest, "So, does the guild have something like a shared database?" John awkwardly scratched the back of his head and admitted that calling it a database was a bit of a stretch. It's more like a collection of reports from those who've killed or encountered monsters. Though, not all adventurers know how to read. So in practice, everyone sticks to familiar places and their usual prey, and news spreads mostly by word of mouth. Sarah's expression darkened slightly. What huge waste, she thought. Then, with a look of keen curiosity, she asked, "What happens to the monsters after they're killed?" John shrugged and explained, "It depends on species. The meat of a ferocious boar is eaten, while the hide and bones are used for weapons and equipment. But you can't eat a poisonous frog, so they're usually just burned." The silence lasted exactly 1 second. Alexander, a representative of the Pharmacists Guild, who until that moment had been silent, looking like someone patiently waiting for his turn, jolted to his feet. His face flushed. He stammered, his eyes widened, and he almost shouted, "What? How dare they burn poisonous frogs?" The hearts of poisonous frogs are an extremely rare ingredient, one of the most valuable in medicine, and he struggled to find the right word. Adventurers are simply burning them like trash. For a moment, the room fell completely silent. John was taken aback and asked again, "Is that really true?" Theophrastus, who had been looking away the whole time with the air of someone who was bored, suddenly perked up and added, "Poisonous frog mucus, by the way, is also used in alchemy, and not in the cheapest way either." John exploded furiously from the bottom of his heart and demanded an explanation. Why? Why had no one ever said a single word about this to the adventurers? Alexander shouted back with no less fervor that they had no idea these frogs even existed in the lands of Grantchester. Otherwise, they would have arranged to purchase them long ago. The argument escalated rapidly. Both were speaking at once, cutting each other off, and Theophrastus was already opening his mouth, clearly intending to chime in. A loud clap of hands cut through it all at once. Sarah waited until everyone was looking at her, and everyone did, including the officials who had been silent until then. Then, with a light, completely unruffled smile, she remarked that it seemed the gentleman did not quite understand what was being discussed. The discussion was about the value of information. The men exchanged glances and asked almost simultaneously, "What kind of value exactly?" Sarah nodded and calmly explained, "The Adventurers Guild possesses detailed information about the monsters inhabiting these lands. Information that pharmacists and alchemists would be willing to buy. But since no one realized what that information was worth, the adventurers were literally burning what they should have been getting paid for." John turned pale. Slowly, like someone who had just been told of a loss he hadn't yet fully grasped. He muttered, "They were burning the remains of monsters along with their profits, and didn't even know it." Sarah continued, "The poisonous frog was just one example, and it was quite possible that among the monsters in the area there were other species useful to completely different professions, which meant that if the guild began sharing such information, its revenues would grow on their own." John swallowed awkwardly, leaning forward slightly, and admitted that it sounded, perhaps, not bad. Alexander silently sank back into his chair, and all three fell silent for a second. Sarah didn't give them time to recover and continued. This applied not only to the Adventurers Guild, but also to pharmacists and alchemists who, just as often, never specified exactly what materials they needed. The silence that followed spoke volumes. Theophrastus was the first to break it. He cleared his throat and explained, with a touch of awkwardness, that alchemists usually purchased everything they needed through trusted trading houses. That's just how it had historically worked out. So, Sarah clarified, the guild buys from a trading house, and the trading house finds its own suppliers. Theophrastus nodded. Alexander immediately added that the system worked much the same way for pharmacists. Sarah listened, paused for a second, and said that, on the whole, this made sense. Specialized intermediaries make the work easier, but when everything is tied to a single trading house, that in itself creates a vulnerability. The guild representatives exchanged glances and asked almost simultaneously why. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to figure out how to explain it more simply, and said, "Because then there won't be any competition." The men stared at her with equally puzzled expressions, and she, glancing at the table, reached for the quill lying in front of her. "Let's say," she said, "that this pen is a vital material for alchemists, and the only merchant who has one is John." Then she addressed him directly and asked him to sell her the pen for $10. John shrugged with the air of someone who found the whole thing strange and said he'd even give it to her for free. He handed the pen across the table, adding under his breath that he really didn't understand what kind of childish nonsense was going on here. Sarah thanked him and took the pen. She immediately turned to Theophrastus and held it up. With a broad smile, she announced that she would sell it to him for $100. Both guild representatives watching the scene couldn't help but laugh. John exclaimed loudly and with genuine indignation that in that case, she could have bought it from him for a higher price. Theophrastus grumbled that this was nothing short of robbery, but immediately lowered his head and muttered that he was joking, of course. Sarah covered one eye, folded her arms across her chest, and, with the same smile, waved a pen, noticing that the gentleman seemed to be indignant. But she was the only pen seller here, so the question was, did they want to sell or did they actually want to buy? The guild representatives fell into a tense silence. She waited exactly as long as necessary, and then placed the pen back in the middle of the table and returned to her usual tone, saying that this was roughly what a market without competition looked like, and that the example was, of course, an exaggeration. John frowned, closed his eyes, and admitted that yes, there is pressure and purchases at absurd prices, and everyone has known this for a long time. Theophrastus, after a brief pause, added that if the guilds exchanged information with one another, they could trade directly. Alexander chimed in. If several firms traded in pens, the deal would be fairer for everyone. The officials along the wall nodded in agreement. And Sarah, frowning slightly, continued, as long as the guilds hide what exactly they need, other merchants won't even realize that a pen is worth anything at all, which means new suppliers simply have no way to break into the market. Everyone exchanged glances, mulling this over. Then she spoke more seriously. The market must be healthy, and it can only be healthy where there is competition, and information is the main weapon in that competition. The guild representatives looked at her in silence, with an expression as if her words hadn't quite sunk in yet. Sarah briefly thought to herself that the trade guilds would probably come to hate her for such reasoning, and it was a good thing they hadn't been invited today. She returned to the map. She pointed to the area they planned to clear, and added that, as it turned out, medicinal herbs grew there as well. Alexander muttered in surprise that this was the first he'd heard of it. Theophrastus looked just as puzzled. Sarah explained that the magical stone mine had been discovered only recently, and no one had really explored the area yet. Castor, who had been silent the whole time with the look of someone fascinated by absolutely everything that was happening, stood up and handed a piece of paper across the table, a list of herbs already collected in that area. At that very moment, one of the maids stepped forward, holding a wooden box. She placed it in front of Alexander and opened the lid. Inside lay herbs, fresh, clearly cut just a short while ago, with the morning dew still clinging to the leaves. The maid explained quietly that they had been delivered that morning by horsemen of the knightly order. Alexander and Theophrastus leaned forward almost simultaneously. Alexander muttered that the quality was exceptional. Theophrastus scanned the contents of the box, and with undisguised amazement, he remarked that the guild usually purchases some of these herbs from other countries, and that the fact that all of this grew literally right next door was beyond belief. Sarah listened and discreetly covered her lips with her hand, which were instinctively trying to break into a smile. Alexander, oblivious to this, lit up and said dreamily that he would start making medicine right away. Theophrastus immediately turned to him and objected vehemently. With raw materials of such high quality, this was the perfect alchemical substance, and turning them into medicine would be a real waste. Alexander flared up in response and exclaimed that herbs of this caliber were meant specifically for healing people, not for potions. Theophrastus didn't take that line down. These herbs can be used to make mana restoratives and elixirs, which are just as necessary. John, leaning back in his chair, watched the unfolding argument with a slight smile. Sarah turned to him and calmly asked, "Do you understand now why Grantchester is even applying for the cleanup?" John nodded and remarked under his breath that his colleagues were perhaps a bit too loud. The girl stood up and said that as far as the reward for the cleanup was concerned, this issue should be discussed jointly with the pharmacists and alchemist guilds. Alexander and Theophrastus stopped mid-sentence, and at the same time, they looked at her. Alexander slowly asked again, so they would have to contribute to the cost as well? Both of them looked a bit pale. Sarah returned to her seat, nodded, and explained that, of course, these were necessary expenses for the safety of the territory where herbs of such high quality grew. The men tried to object, but she continued, Grantchester had no intention of skimping on funds to protect its residents. However, it was only fair that the guild that had invested more should receive priority in the distribution of the herbs. Theophrastus turned pale and cautiously asked, "And what will happen if the guild doesn't meet its financial commitment?" Sarah replied, "Nothing. This is a request, not a demand. No one will be punished." Both of them exhaled and relaxed slightly. Sarah paused for a moment and added that in that case, they would have to find the money for the reward elsewhere. This meant that the estate would buy up all the collected herbs, at a reasonable markup, and put them up for auction. She said this completely calmly, with a slight smile, her expression unchanged. Alexander and Theophrastus turned even paler than before. Then she added that some of it might go to other estates. After hearing this, both of them stared at her with equally wide eyes and open mouths. Mary, the personal maid who had been standing behind Sarah the whole time, struggled to hold back a smile and thought to herself, "So that's how it works. That's what real competition is like." Several items on the agenda had been checked off, the request to the Adventurers Guild had been submitted, and the pharmacists had been heard. The second half of the interdisciplinary brainstorming session lay ahead. When the first part of the meeting finally ended, that special silence that follows a long and intense conversation hung over the table. The maids silently cleared the box of herbs from the table. Sarah folded her hands in front of her and allowed herself a second to simply sit in silence, staring into space ahead of her. The first half of the interdisciplinary brainstorming session had gone quite well. They'd managed to shift a significant portion of the cleanup costs onto the guilds, which meant that expanding the extraction of magic stones would proceed faster than she'd anticipated. That was good news. But to be honest, the real work was just beginning. The development of Elma Brandy, the very project she, if she were to be honest with herself, was most passionate about. In her past life, she had been a great lover of fine spirits, and the mere thought of creating something truly worthy here made her eyes light up on their own. New items immediately appeared on her to-do list. Hiring alchemists, securing equipment and stills, and finding a suitable place for experiments. Sarah turned to Theophrastus and, with the friendliest smile she could muster, asked if she could ask him a few questions. The man literally jumped up on the spot, looking as if he'd been caught off guard, and hastily assured her that, of course, she could ask anything she wanted. Sarah mentally noted that she seemed to have gone a bit overboard with the first part of the meeting, but she tried to give her face the most innocent expression possible. She said she'd like to ask the guild for their cooperation. She needed an experienced alchemist and a craftsman capable of making a distillation cube for conducting experiments. Theophrastus raised an eyebrow and asked with genuine surprise, could it be that the young lady is also interested in alchemy? At that moment, Rebecca, who had been sitting beside her the whole time with a completely unperturbed expression, spoke up and calmly explained that her ward was 8 years old, and at that age, noble young ladies generally do not engage in alchemy. The guild representatives exchanged glances and almost simultaneously jumped up from their seats. Theophrastus asked again, bewildered. 8 years, that was for sure, because after everything they'd heard today, they were absolutely certain they were dealing with an experienced adult, not a child. Sarah laughed awkwardly and thought to herself that everything had gone back to the same old routine. What mattered to her now was something else, securing the right people and equipment, not explaining the workings of her own mind yet again. When the excitement had died down a bit and everyone had returned to their seats, Theophrastus fell silent for a few moments, deep in thought. Then he asked whether young craftsmen or apprentices would be suitable for her. Sarah raised her eyebrows slightly and replied that as long as they had the knowledge and skills, neither age nor gender mattered to her. Theophrastus looked at her with a new expression and said quietly that, actually, his own daughter was also an alchemist. Noticing the surprise on the girl's face, he waved his hand dismissively and explained that she had been studying alongside him since childhood and had long since surpassed many renowned alchemists in skill. He was willing to vouch for that. As for the distillation cube, his daughter has a friend, the blacksmith's daughter, a highly skilled artisan, whose cubes his daughter still uses to this day. He paused for a second and added, in a quieter voice, that both of them were women, and therefore were not registered with the guild and did not receive work worthy of their skill level. If the Grantchester estate took them under its wing, they would undoubtedly become a reliable asset. Sarah and Rebecca exchanged glances. Sarah pressed her fist to her lips and thought for a few seconds. In other words, these two aren't listed with the guild, but it seems they're exactly the one she needs. She turned to Robert and asked if there were any obstacles to hiring artisans without guild registration. Robert shrugged slightly and leaned toward her, saying that she could do as she saw fit. It didn't violate the law. Sarah nodded. Then she turned to Theophrastus and asked him to tell his daughter and her friend that she'd like to meet with them as soon as possible. Theophrastus literally beamed, nodding so vigorously that he nearly lost his balance. Alexander watched the whole scene from the sidelines, his expression growing noticeably gloomier with every new word. As for the plan to develop Elma, there was one last unresolved issue, a place to conduct the experiments. Sarah turned back to Robert and asked if there was a suitable room in the castle for alchemical experiments. Her uncle looked at her intently and replied that on the eastern side of the castle there was a tower where such research had been conducted in the past. It was old, but perfectly suitable for any purpose. At these words, Theophrastus abruptly rose from his seat and hastily apologized for interrupting, but clarified, "You're talking about the Paracelsus laboratory, aren't you?" Sarah's attention shifted away from her uncle, and she repeated the name, unconsciously tilting her head to one side. Robert, noticing her expression, explained with a smile. Paracelsus was an alchemist whom the former Marquis of Grantchester had invited to the castle and allowed to conduct research right here. Theophrastus added that Paracelsus was his great-grandfather. A chain of connections instantly formed in Sarah's mind, and she murmured quietly, "So that's how it is." Robert chuckled and added casually that, according to legend, Paracelsus was a forward-thinking man who embraced everything new and spent money like water. At these words, Theophrastus visibly paled. Sarah frowned in displeasure and asked her uncle in a low voice to stop, but then calmly stated aloud that research always requires investment. It's completely normal and inevitable. Rebecca, standing nearby, pressed her hand to her forehead, exhaled quietly, and apologized to those present for her childhood friend's behavior. Theophrastus, having regained his composure somewhat, said that all the experiments his great-grandfather had conducted in the castle were classified. Not even family members knew the details, let alone the guild. Sarah gasped inwardly with delight. Secret research at the castle was exactly the kind of thing that fired the imagination. But aloud she remarked cautiously that if these records had survived, they could be of immense practical value and, perhaps, yield a substantial profit. Robert, glancing at his beaming niece, awkwardly scratched the back of his head and admitted that he wasn't sure if it was worth mentioning. But the current Marquis of Grantchester had absolutely no interest in alchemy, and he hadn't inherited Paracelsus's notes. Sarah's mood darkened sharply inside. This meant potentially colossal losses where there could have been colossal profits. Theophrastus buried his face in his hands and managed with difficulty to say that his great-grandfather's works had remained unclaimed. Robert, noticing the mood of both of them, hastened to add, "Most likely, they weren't lost, just hidden somewhere in the castle." This was because the previous Marquis had died suddenly in a carriage accident and had left no will specifying a location. Sarah let out a slight sigh of relief and turned to Theophrastus, asking if Paracelsus himself had left any instructions or notes on the matter. He slowly shook his head. Theophrastus frowned and said tensely that his great-grandfather had once suddenly disappeared. This had happened while the previous Marquis was still alive, back in the days when the abduction of talented mages was commonplace, so in all likelihood, the same thing had happened to him. Sarah froze thoughtfully, staring straight ahead. It seemed there would be no leads, neither from Paracelsus himself nor from his great-grandfather. She sighed inwardly, accepted this as a fact, and told herself that while a lingering unease remained, the goal had, on the whole, been achieved. She had the staff, the equipment would be provided, and a location had been found. It was time to move on to the Elma brandy. At that thought, she cupped her cheeks in her hands and smiled completely involuntarily. Alexander's voice snapped her out of her reverie. The pharmacist addressed her somewhat awkwardly, looking like someone who wasn't entirely sure whether what he was about to say was appropriate. He asked if Lady Sarah might also be interested in a female pharmacist. The girl raised her eyebrows in surprise and looked at him. Alexander immediately rushed to explain himself. Since she, like Theophrastus, had said that gender didn't matter to her, this woman might prove useful. Sarah understood everything immediately. So, after she had taken in Theophrastus's daughter and her artisan friend, everyone had decided this was an opportunity. She awkwardly touched her cheek with her finger and asked, "Do you have a daughter too?" Alexander shook his head and explained that he was single. He was referring to a girl from the house next door. She'd been gathering herbs for him since childhood, then began helping him make medicines, and now, in terms of skill, she surpasses many students who've graduated from the academy. But according to guild rules, women cannot become official apprentices, so she is listed only as an assistant. And that, he added, lowering his gaze, is deeply unfair given her abilities. Sarah folded her arms across her chest and seethed inwardly. It's the same in every guild, the same old story everywhere. She was just about to reply when something clicked in her head. She straightened up abruptly and gasped inwardly. Alchemist, pharmacist, herbs, if you put all that together, you could get into cosmetics. A classic opportunity for someone from another world, and she'd almost overlooked it, getting carried away with the brandy. But something inside her still hesitated. Poaching someone else's student, even if it was for her own good, felt strange, almost awkward. Rebecca interrupted her musings. The governess quietly called her charge by name, and when the girl turned around, she lowered her voice and said, "Many women give up on their dreams simply because they are women. And if this young woman truly wants more, isn't it the duty of those who can lend her a helping hand?" Sarah heard in these words an exact reflection of her own thoughts and nodded. then turned to Alexander and said that Rebecca was right. She agreed to take on the young pharmacist. Alexander literally jumped out of his seat, and he bowed. Theophrastus, standing beside him, rose in turn, and he bowed with no less feeling. Then both guild representatives spoke in unison, expressing their heartfelt gratitude to the compassionate young lady and the entire Grantchester estate. Sarah chuckled to herself and felt a slight twinge of awkwardness. They had called her compassionate, yet, if she were honest with herself, she had acted out of pure calculation. A new item immediately appeared on the agenda: to hire a female pharmacist and explore the possibility of developing cosmetics. Robert, noticing that the discussion had come to an end, stood up and announced that today's agenda had been exhausted, thanking everyone for their participation. The guild representatives took their leave and exited the hall. They moved to the adjacent lounge. The silence lasted just long enough for the door to close, and then the officials began to laugh almost simultaneously. Robert shook his head with a smile and said that Sarah was truly no ordinary girl. One of the officials, wiping away tears, exclaimed that they should have seen the faces of the guild leaders. That's what happens when you underestimate a child. Another added that she had cleverly shifted the cleanup costs onto someone else's shoulders, and a third admitted that they, too, had underestimated her at first. Castor, standing next to Robert, nodded in agreement and remarked quietly that today had been a particularly rough day for the guild representatives, and there wasn't a trace of sympathy in his voice. Sarah listened to all this while sitting on an empty sofa against the wall, her back resting against the soft backrest, and frowned. She muttered quietly and with completely sincere displeasure that she'd worked hard for the sake of the domain, and yet she'd received not a word of praise, but instead they were discussing her as if she were some kind of magician at a fair. She awkwardly scratched the corner of her eye. Then she thought to herself that perhaps she had gone too far after all. From the outside, it already looked like cheating in governance, and she should slow down a bit. But until she became truly independent, until the estate situation stabilized, she couldn't allow Grantchester to fall. Rebecca approached her quietly. She sat down beside her, leaned in a little closer, and said in a low voice, almost a whisper, this, of course, wasn't exactly a reward in the usual sense, but tomorrow they would try something new. Noticing the surprise on her ward's face, the governess pressed a finger to her lips with a faint, mysterious smile and added that she would teach her magic. Sarah froze, and then her eyes lit up with that same fire that always appeared whenever a new, truly breathtaking item was added to the plan. A new item immediately appeared on the list: learn magic. Later that evening, Sarah was lying in the bathtub, savoring the moment as if it were the only truly well-deserved pleasure of the entire day. Sarah stared at the ceiling and thought to herself that ever since the Grantchester family had taken her in, her life had turned into one continuous packed schedule. But a hot bath at the end of the day, that was something she had no intention of giving up under any circumstances. In her past life, she had bathed once a week. To live freely and comfortably, one needed strength. She understood this more and more clearly. And in this world, strength was measured, in part, by magic. Later, as she lay in bed, staring into the darkness above her, the thought of tomorrow's lesson wouldn't leave her mind. The next morning, she and Rebecca were sitting in the garden gazebo. Rebecca smiled brightly and called her ward by name, and she gently asked her not to forget her manners. Sarah froze with her fork halfway to her mouth, her eyes widening in alarm. She immediately bowed slightly, muttering an apology. She was just looking forward to the magic lesson so much. Rebecca covered her mouth with her hand to hide a smile and said that this was the first time she'd seen a truly childlike expression on Sarah's face. Then she tilted her head slightly to one side and asked her protege to tell her what she already knew about magic. Sarah nodded and began to explain, methodically and in order. In this world, almost everyone is born with some reserve of mana, but having it doesn't in itself mean one has the ability to use magic. To wield magic, one must undergo awakening, that is, the ability to imbue mana with an attribute and a direction. Without awakening, magic can only be activated through artifacts or magic circles. There are only 7 attributes: fire, water, wind, earth, wood, light, and darkness, and anything that doesn't fit into any of these belongs to the nothing attribute. Rebecca listened and nodded, and when Sarah fell silent, she added that the percentage of awakened among the nobility was significantly higher than among commoners, even though almost the entire royal family and the highest nobility were, in one way or another, awakened mages. Sarah nodded and voiced the obvious conclusion. So there's a hereditary factor. The same attribute tends to manifest more frequently within a single lineage, and that is precisely why noble families are so eager to recruit gifted mages into their ranks. As she said this, she turned slightly pale. Rebecca noticed. Without saying a word, she turned to the 2 maids and asked them to leave them alone for a moment. Sarah was calmly sipping her tea, but panic was already raging in her mind. She hadn't told anyone about her water attribute. Not a word, not even a hint. And if it turned out now that, according to some absurd canon, she was turning into a rare mage with cheat-level abilities, it would create problems on a completely different scale than the estate's debts. Rebecca looked at her protege with a slight frown at how deliberately calm she appeared, and she asked quietly, now that they were alone, when exactly had Sarah's water attribute awakened? Sarah choked on her tea. She coughed, set down her cup, and asked in a panic, how on earth did Rebecca even know about this? The governess frowned slightly and said that she shouldn't react that way. A mage must always remain calm. Rebecca explained that before meeting Sarah, a friend of hers, a fairy, had told her about it. The girl stared at her in surprise and asked again, could fairies really do that? Rebecca took the cup in both hands, closed her eyes, and replied that her fairy was special. She could even detect hidden, as yet unmanifested awakened attributes. Sarah looked silently at her governess and thought to herself, wow, what a twist. Then, aloud and with genuine surprise, she asked, why then did Rebecca's eyes widen so much when she heard my reaction? The governess frowned slightly and said simply, because Sarah's water attribute isn't her only one. If she trained, she would be able to use all 7. There was a long pause. Sarah frowned intently and asked, is that really that significant? Rebecca turned away, exhaled heavily with the air of someone explaining the obvious to a slow-witted child, and said, in this country, only 2 people possess all the attributes at the same time, His Majesty the King and the Crown Prince. Hearing this, Sarah gasped in horror. How is that even possible? How could something like that happen to an ordinary person? Rebecca continued, now with a hint of concern in her voice, explaining that this was precisely why she had agreed to become a governess. A girl of no noble lineage, a stranger in the world of the aristocracy, and yet the bearer of all the attributes. It was like throwing a piece of meat in front of a hawk. Then she exhaled softly and smiled, and added that it seemed she'd worried for nothing. Sarah stared at her spellbound, her hands pressed to her lips, and asked, could it really be that Rebecca had believed in her, so small as she was, from the very beginning? The governess turned away for a second and said, without looking, that she hadn't doubted it for a second. Sarah frowned and thought to herself that she was a true cheater in this world, and that was exactly why she couldn't let her guard down. She had to try even harder to be able to protect herself. The task of learning the basics of magic was completed. A little later, they moved to the magic training ground. Rebecca folded her hands in front of her, stepped slightly to the side, and asked Sarah to start by using water. The girl nodded, closed her eyes, cupped her palms, and concentrated. She remembered how her teacher in her past life had said that magic shouldn't be practiced alone, which was exactly why she had never practiced without supervision. The next second, a small ball of water appeared above her cupped palms, responding to the slightest movement of her finger, smooth, transparent, and slightly trembling. Rebecca said that was very good. The next second, Sarah aimed at one of the targets, and the projectile struck the very center. The governess went on to explain that magic is activated through an understanding of the essence of an element. Not through effort, but through awareness. Sarah froze thoughtfully beside her and murmured under her breath, essence. How was she supposed to understand the essence of fire if she'd never felt it as her own? Sarah tensed up. She jutted her index finger into the air and, frowning, concentrated, going over everything she knew in her head. Combustion involves fuel, oxygen, a heat source, and a chemical oxidation reaction. She held onto that image as tightly as she could. Nothing happened. A second passed. Then another, silence, still air, no fire. Sarah lowered her hand and looked at Rebecca with the bewildered expression of someone who had been completely confident in their approach and now couldn't figure out exactly where they'd gone wrong. Rebecca raised one hand, keeping the other on her chest, and calmly explained that everyone has their own perception of the essence of an attribute, which is precisely why it's so difficult to teach this directly. At the academy, spells are taught for situations like this. Sarah took a few steps toward her and murmured with interest that spells were very interesting. Rebecca added that they weren't mandatory, but they increased both stability and power. Sarah clenched her fists and, unable to contain her excitement, began to bounce slightly in place, saying she'd really like to see it. The governess smiled at this, exhaled quietly, and warned that fire wasn't her strong suit, so she shouldn't expect too much. Then she turned away, closed her eyes, and froze for a few seconds, gathering herself. She made a few smooth, sweeping motions with her arms, and her voice took on that special intonation, clear and solemn. Used when casting spells, she was summoning the fire salamander to bring forth a flame from the void. With a sharp forward sweep of her hand, she cried out the incantation. Sarah watched it all with undisguised admiration. Such gesture, such intonation, such pathos. And in the next second, a tiny flame, no bigger than a candle's, appeared before Rebecca's outstretched hand. It flickered for a second and went out. Sarah immediately turned away. Her shoulders began to shake noticeably. She tried with all her might not to make a sound, but she wasn't very successful because she hadn't expected such a grand display of pathos to yield such a meager result, and she even felt a little embarrassed by her own laughter. Rebecca glanced at her protégé, blushed slightly, and declared with dignity that she was much better with lighting. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand and nodded without turning around. A few minutes later, she pulled herself together, exhaled, and returned to the task at hand. She needed to grasp the essence, not through theory, but through imagery, through sensation. She raised her finger again and closed her eyes. And she tried to sense something similar to the feeling she'd had when summoning water, only different. A faint glow appeared above her finger, then something twitched. And instead of fire, a small drop of warm water fell onto her palm. There was a soft splish. Sarah stared at her wet palm in confusion and muttered into the air. It was hot. It was hot water. Rebecca watched her with a completely amused expression, laughed, covering her mouth with her hand, and asked, had the girl been thinking about water while she was doing that, because water plus fire naturally makes boiling water? Sarah shook her head, trying to compose herself. She thought that in her past life, starting a fire had been a completely ordinary thing. All it took was a simple flick of a lighter. So why couldn't it be just as simple? With a flick? The next second, she snapped her fingers, more out of habit than on purpose, and opened her eyes wide in surprise. A small flame began to glow slowly, as if reluctantly, at the tip of her finger. It worked. Rebecca clasped her hands in front of her and exclaimed that it was magnificent. Sarah didn't turn around. She was staring intently at the fire in her own fingers, thinking that a concrete image had worked where theory had failed. Not the chemistry of combustion, not oxygen and fuel, but simply a click, a simple and intuitive gesture from another life. Then she stretched out her hand and mentally reached for something more, for movement, for a surge of energy. The fire in her palm flickered and suddenly began to swirl, spreading out in vortexes. And for a moment, the entire area was illuminated by an uneven, living light. Sarah stretched her arm forward, and the stream of fire struck the wooden target. It crackled, charred at the edges, and sagged, losing its shape. Sarah raised her fists in triumph and beamed from ear to ear, loudly announcing that she'd succeeded. Rebecca watched her in silence, and there was that special look in her eyes that comes when a person sees something that goes beyond all expectations. Two abilities awakened at once, without a single spell. It was simply incredible. From then on, Sarah didn't stop. Inspired by everything she remembered from the anime and games of her past life, she tried different spells one after another. And one after another, they worked. The attributes awakened with such ease, as if they had simply been waiting to be summoned. Rebecca was particularly impressed by the little earthen figure, which had formed from a clump of dirt and began obediently stomping around the courtyard behind its mistress. In the end, Sarah got so caught up in the game that she used up every last drop of her mana and simply collapsed to the ground right in the middle of the training ground before she could even reach the bench. She spent the next 2 days in bed, and that too was honest in its own way. The 2 items on the plan, to complete basic training and awaken all her attributes, had been checked off. While Sarah snored quietly in her room, a smile on her face even in her sleep, the atmosphere in the Lord's study was completely different. Robert paced by the window and absent-mindedly asked the maid, had his niece really not come to her senses yet? Rebecca assured him that it was just a case of mana depletion, but he couldn't shake his unease. The maid said nothing. She simply approached, held out a tray with the morning mail, and handed it to him with a curtsy. Robert took the top letter and opened it, and as he read, his face slowly grew pale. By the end of the letter, he was trembling slightly. The clerk sitting at the desk with the papers looked up and asked with concern, "What's wrong?" Robert could barely tear his eyes away from the page and said that his father, the Marquis of Grantchester, was planning to visit. Formally, it was just to check on how things were going. But during the time his niece had been leading her major meeting, and he himself had supported her in everything, so much had been accomplished at the estate. Double-entry bookkeeping, a plan to standardize documents, a trading house, negotiations with the guilds, and that was far from a complete list. If the Marquis gets angry and orders the reforms to be halted, it will all come crashing down. It would be a complete disaster. The air in the office seemed to grow heavy. The officials exchanged glances and remained silent, because there was nothing to say. Robert stared at the letter, and panic was unfolding in his mind, which he was trying with all his might not to show. In her room, Sarah lay peacefully in bed, snoring softly. A couple of days later, Sarah had recovered and came to her uncle's office. And within the very first seconds, she was literally swept away by a wave of attention. All the officials and adults were already there. And as soon as she crossed the threshold, they began congratulating her one after another on the awakening of her magic, and someone immediately handed her a bouquet of flowers. Sarah looked at all these people, at how sincerely they were rejoicing, at how worried they'd been over the past 2 days, and she smiled brightly, slightly taken aback by the surprise, and thanked them all at once. Benjamin immediately turned to her and asked if she was all right. After all, he'd heard that she'd collapsed from mana exhaustion. The girl nodded and apologized for making everyone worry. Next, James approached her and handed her another bouquet. Sarah smiled gently and said the flowers were very beautiful. A little to the side, officials were whispering among themselves that James shouldn't have rushed forward like that, and Robert, watching this, muttered quietly that perhaps he, too, should have given her a gift. James, paying no attention to anyone, explained that the flowers were from him personally and the vase was from his wife. Sarah gasped and asked admiringly, "Did his wife really go out of her way to make that?" James closed his eyes and said that she had made the vase herself, perhaps a bit over the top for a woman's hobby. Sarah gasped. How could it be over the top? Such beauty, and just a hobby? Then she fell silent immediately, turning pale. All the adults turned to look at her at once. The girl regained her composure, curtsied, and asked him to convey her sincere gratitude to James's wife. James bowed and smiled gently, saying he would certainly pass it on. While the other officials approached Sarah one by one and exchanged a few words with her, Rebecca walked over to Robert, who had already taken a seat at the head of the table, and he asked in a low voice, "Is something wrong?" The governess smiled awkwardly and admitted that since that morning, she and her charge had been trying to find a suitable hobby for her. A lady of noble birth is expected to have one. But Sarah's artistic skills, to put it mildly, turned out to be rather peculiar. Neither painting nor embroidery worked out. Sarah, overhearing this out of the corner of her ear, jumped up and exclaimed indignantly that she had asked not to discuss this in front of everyone. Robert shot his niece a sidelong glance and turned to Rebecca with a question. Wasn't horseback riding her own hobby? Sarah immediately raised her hand and announced that she wanted to learn too. The officials laughed in unison, and Rebecca said with a smile that in that case, they should make sure they could go on a long ride together. Sarah calmed down a little, but one thought kept running through her mind. It seemed that cheating really wouldn't solve all their problems. A little while later, they moved to the lounge. Robert sat down across from Rebecca and Sarah, and, after a moment's pause, said that his father, the Marquis of Grantchester, was planning to visit the castle. In 3 days. Sarah frowned slightly, but replied calmly. So they'd have to explain everything properly and make sure the Marquis understood the true state of affairs on the estate and accepted the reforms. Then she looked at her uncle and stopped short. Robert was sitting there, his face rapidly losing all color, and a second later, he covered it with his hands. The girl asked, "What's wrong?" He lowered his hands and said he'd simply had a nightmare. His father was furious, and everything was back to square one. At these words, he began to shake noticeably. Sarah looked at him and, mimicking an angry elderly gentleman, said with furrowed brows, "Double accounting? What nonsense! Put everything back the way it was immediately." Then she softened a little and remembered, Grandpa is a man of strong character. That's true. But it was precisely after that incident long ago, when the estate was cruelly defrauded, that he swore never to trust anyone but his family with the accounts. And that's exactly why Robert had started handling them himself back then. Sarah smiled gently at her uncle and said, "So, we all need to get together and properly prepare for Grandpa's arrival." New items immediately appeared on the to-do list. Prepare for the Marquis's arrival, make a list of what needed to be explained, and prepare a list of documents. Robert, having regained his composure somewhat, said that the books for this quarter were almost closed and that they were generally ready for the report. Sarah nodded and said that in that case, they needed to show Grandpa the balance sheet and the income statement for the current period so he could see the true state of affairs with his own eyes. A stack of papers immediately appeared before them, and the three of them began to heatedly discuss whether to shuffle the sheets, make notes, and revisit what had already been said. Sarah suggested bringing in the maids. That way, they'd definitely get everything done by tomorrow. More items were added to the plan. Draw up the balance sheet, prepare the profit and loss statement, and work out and rehearse their explanation. Then Rebecca added quietly that as long as the Marquis was at the estate, she and Sarah wouldn't go into the study. Sarah silently agreed. A woman and a child constantly present at meetings of adult men would certainly raise unnecessary questions. Robert smirked, crossed his arms over his chest, and leaned back against the sofa, then nodded in agreement and said that he'd like to ask for help, but not while his father was there. No way. The girl frowned and said aloud what she should have said long ago, that once they closed the block, she would stop helping with the management. Robert instantly sat up straight and asked in a panic, "How can that be?" Sarah furrowed her brow. Rebecca stood silently beside her, and the girl repeated firmly that she was merely a temporary assistant. Her main priority was her studies. Rebecca added that she, too, was just a governess and was supporting Sarah precisely in that capacity. Robert moved closer to them, bracing his hands on the table, and cried out, looking utterly devastated, "So Rebecca is leaving me, too?" Then he sank back onto the sofa, rested his head in his hands, and fell silent. Sarah looked at him, sighed, held out her hand, and said that if things got really tough, she would definitely help. Rebecca smiled and quietly remarked that Grandpa's visit seemed like it would be a great excuse. The next day, Sarah was walking through the mansion's hallways with Rebecca and said that it was going to be a stressful day. But once Grandpa arrived and everything was settled, she would finally be able to get back to her normal studies and to the magic she was so eager to practice. Suddenly, Sarah's attention was drawn to the maids in the hallway. They had stopped and frozen in place. The girl asked, "What's going on? Aren't we going to the study?" The girls curtsied, and the head maid, Eliza, explained that the Marquis of Grandchester had already arrived. Sarah and Rebecca exchanged glances. The girl dropped her hands and cried out in confusion. Already? He was supposed to arrive the day after tomorrow. Eliza folded her hands in front of her and replied softly that they'd been told the same thing. But the Marquis had suddenly arrived at the castle alone, without his entourage. To herself, Sarah instantly calculated the losses. All their plans, everything they'd been preparing to explain, all the documents they'd intended to lay out in the proper order, all of it had gone up in smoke at once. She puffed out her cheeks, pressed her palms to her face, and muttered that it was customary to honor agreements after all. That was the very foundation of business etiquette, and that now all that remained was to rely on her uncle and hope he wouldn't lose his composure. Rebecca, noticing the expression on her ward's face, turned to the maids and asked, why had they come here in the first place? Why weren't they doing their jobs? Why weren't they serving tea? Eliza frowned slightly and explained that the Marquis had ordered them to leave the study. Sarah asked in surprise, "What about Grandpa?" The maid, lowering her gaze, explained more precisely. The Marquis had walked in, scanned the study, and begun to loudly protest that women had been seated there. He told them outright that he didn't need maids like that and asked them to leave. Sarah's eyes widened, and she frowned so deeply that her eyebrows nearly met at the bridge of her nose. And she asked slowly, "He just went and kicked them out without even seeing how they worked?" Eliza lowered her eyes and remained silent. The other maids stood silently as well. The next second, Sarah sprang to her feet. She had only one thought in her head. This was too much. She would go there and make him apologize, take back what he said. She had almost reached the door when a hand appeared in front of her. Sarah shouted for Rebecca to let her through. The governess stood there completely unperturbed and said, "You can't. You're not being graceful right now." The girl blushed and asked with a frown, "Do I really have to remain graceful, even in a situation like this?" Rebecca lifted her chin slightly and replied, "Especially in a situation like this." Then she looked down at her charge slightly from above and said calmly, but with a palpable weight in her voice, "If Sarah bursts into the study now, the Marquis will only be confirmed in his opinion that she's a girl from the lower classes, ill-mannered and uncontrollable. He won't even listen." Sarah fell silent. Dark energy began to swirl around her. The maids instinctively took half a step back and watched this little scene with alarm, clearly worried. Rebecca noticed this but paid it no mind and continued, "Men have their own rules, and women have their own ways of waging war, and for the sake of these insulted women, Sarah must act with grace, not in the heat of the moment." She added that she, too, was outraged by the Marquis's behavior, and that what they had all achieved together at the estate was a source of genuine pride. If the Marquis of Grandchester failed to understand that, then they could only pity him. Then she lifted her chin again and declared that someone with an extra appendage isn't necessarily superior to others. He simply lacks the sense to realize it. Silence hung in the air. Sarah and the maids all stared at Rebecca at the same time. The girl processed what she had heard and thought to herself, "An appendage? Was that exactly the implication she thought it was?" And she said it with such a completely unflappable, noble expression. In the next second, the atmosphere in the hallway noticeably warmed up. The maids giggled quietly, covering their mouths with their hands. Sarah laughed next, pressing her palm to her lips, and she murmured that it was possible to tease so elegantly, with such subtext, and without a single unnecessary word. Rebecca leaned toward her slightly and looked at her with a tender smile. The dark energy surrounding Sarah dissipated as imperceptibly as it had appeared, and she apologized to her governess, saying that she had finally regained her composure. Eliza approached her and said quietly, "Thank you for worrying so much about us, but we're used to this sort of thing. To be honest, They were more worried about how Lord Robert and the other officials would handle the situation. Sarah nodded anxiously and muttered that it was true. After all, they hadn't even had time to properly prepare for his arrival. Everything was supposed to be different. Rebecca, standing next to her, frowned in displeasure and remarked that it was precisely because the maids, along with Sarah, had completely spoiled the officials that they were now unable to act on their own. Sarah replied with a completely innocent expression that Rebecca spoils Uncle Robert, too. The governess blushed slightly, threw up her hands, and hastily explained, "It's simply because Robert thinks too slowly. It's nothing personal." Eliza, seizing the moment, teased her, "Surely it's all because of that extra appendage." Rebecca gave her a sharp look. The maids giggled quietly again. Sarah thought to herself that their productivity was certainly dropping dramatically right now, but so be it. When everyone had calmed down a bit, Rebecca sighed and said that today's plan had completely fallen apart, so perhaps she and Sarah could head back. The girl nodded and immediately froze because something clicked in her head. She raised her hand and her eyes sparkled. Since they had some free time now, and the maids were idle anyway, why not pop into the Paracelsus lab? Rebecca frowned slightly, remembering that this was the very tower on the east side of the castle that Sarah had chosen for developing Elma Brandy. The girl nodded and added that no one had used the tower in a long time, so cleaning it up wouldn't hurt, and at the same time, they could look around and figure out what was actually in there. Rebecca paused for a second and agreed. Sarah raised her clenched fist and announced, "We're going on a reconnaissance mission to the laboratory of the great alchemist Paracelsus." The original plan, to prepare materials and rehearse an explanation for her uncle, was completely forgotten, but a new plan immediately took its place, to explore Paracelsus's laboratory. Rebecca pressed 2 fingers to her cheek and asked with a slight smile, "Why don't we call over the people we'll be working with while we're at it?" Sarah looked at her in surprise and clarified, "The daughter of Theophrastus the alchemist, her blacksmith friend, and Alexander's assistant." Rebecca nodded, and Sarah paused for a second, then nodded to herself. For the girls, the lab would be their workplace. That made sense. But a sudden invitation from the nobility, wouldn't that come across as pressure? Wouldn't it deprive them of the chance to decline calmly? She voiced exactly that, quietly and with a hint of concern. Rebecca waved her hand dismissively and replied with the same light smile that if they made it clear right away that a refusal was entirely possible, everything would be fine. The girls would decide for themselves. Sarah paused for a second and agreed. A little while later, they were both standing in the hallway, already changed. Sarah tightened her belt and felt 3 times more energetic. Rebecca walked beside her, clearly pleased. She was quietly humming to herself and swaying her head slightly in time with the music, and her face bore that special look of anticipation that Sarah had never seen on her before. The girl glanced at her and asked why she was so happy. The governess turned around, smiled her usual flawless smile, and said that she'd loved adventures since childhood, and that the legendary alchemist's laboratory was, perhaps, a dream come true. They had to take a carriage to the tower, and Sarah sat by the window with a hint of discontent, watching the courtyards flash by and thinking that the whole thing was a bit ridiculous. The tower suddenly seemed towering, with narrow windows, almost hidden beneath a thick carpet of ivy and wild grapevines. Sarah looked at it from the carriage window and muttered quietly, "So this is Paracelsus's laboratory." New items appeared on the to-do list: set up a distillation area and explore the tower. When the carriage came to a stop, Sarah stepped out along with Rebecca and the maids. 3 people were already standing at the foot of the tower, and they were the first to spot her, calling her name almost simultaneously. Sarah looked up, genuinely surprised. They had arrived much sooner than she had expected. At that, all 3 girls exchanged glances and, in unison, expressed their gratitude for the invitation. Standing a little to the side were 2 men, and Theophrastus stepped forward first and asked permission to introduce his daughter. Alicia, 17 years old, an alchemist, bowed her head slightly with a smile and said that they had been looking forward to this. Next to her was Teresa, also 17, a blacksmith. She nodded broadly and without ceremony and said she was very pleased to meet them. Standing next to them was a young man whom Sarah hadn't noticed at first. He introduced himself briefly and to the point. Fran, 22 years old, a blacksmith, formerly Teresa's father's senior apprentice, who had moved on to another master after his death last year. When Teresa heard her father's name mentioned, her expression didn't change at all. She merely pursed her lips for a split second and then smiled again as if nothing had happened, and Sarah mentally took note of this. Alexander spoke next. He gave the girl next to him a gentle nudge with his elbow. She flinched almost imperceptibly and stepped forward. Amelia, 19 years old, his assistant, smiled gently and with a touch of embarrassment and said that it was a great honor for her to receive such an invitation. Sarah nodded and introduced herself. And immediately, after glancing around at the whole group, she narrowed her eyes slightly and noticed that the girls hadn't invited the older people along on their own. She was, of course, happy to see everyone. It was just interesting. Teresa immediately frowned and, without looking at Fran, casually remarked that she'd told him straight out. She didn't need security, she could handle it on her own, but he'd insisted anyway. At these words, Fran looked away with a completely inscrutable expression. Next, Amelia smiled a little guiltily and admitted that her father, that is, Alexander, had expressed the desire himself. He wanted to see the lab. Both adults immediately began to deny this with such speed and such obvious awkwardness that it became clear that was exactly how it had happened. Theophrastus insisted that he simply wanted to make sure his daughter had arrived safely. Alexander spoke of some urgent business nearby, and both spoke at the same time, not listening to a single word. All three girls exchanged glances and burst out laughing at once, covering their mouths with their hands and clearly not trying very hard to hold it in. When everyone had calmed down a bit, Sarah took a few steps forward and raised her hand. The investigation was about to begin. The door wouldn't open. It simply wouldn't budge, having become firmly stuck in its frame over the years. So Fran and Alexander stepped up together, exchanged a glance, grabbed hold of it, and took the whole thing off its hinges. It smelled of dust inside. Almost everyone let out a quiet gasp of admiration at the same time. Sarah looked around, nodded, and said it had a great atmosphere. And then she sneezed so hard that Rebecca instinctively took a step to the side. After regaining her composure a bit, Sarah turned to Eliza and said that, to start with, they needed to find the distillation cube. The maid nodded immediately, pulled out a map, and reported that the cube was presumably in one of the laboratories. Sarah asked, on which floor? Eliza, after carefully studying the map and turning it slightly, honestly replied that there were several labs and no precise directions. Then, without looking up from a map, she added that in addition to the laboratories, the tower contained an archive, a library, a bedroom, a living room, a dining room, a kitchen, a servant's quarters, and even a bathroom. Sarah gasped. Then she stared at the map, then slowly turned to her companions. And her eyes sparkled brightly when she announced that they would go through everything in order. New items were immediately added to the plan. Find the distillation still and inspect all the rooms. Cleaning was listed as a separate item for the maids. The maids set to work methodically and immediately, kicking up such clouds of dust that in some rooms, people had to stay by the door. Meanwhile, Fran returned to the front door and set to work on the hinges. The first laboratory was found on the third floor. Everything was in such complete disarray that Sarah simply stood in the doorway for a few seconds, then stated aloud, "The cube isn't here." But there were an incredible number of records, and everything was in utter chaos. The archive was next, and when they opened the door, everyone who had managed to get there scattered in different directions almost immediately, talking over one another. Theophrastus leaned over an open drawer and exclaimed that they were meteorites. Alicia froze by the shelf of minerals, while Alexander reached for a stack of documents. Sarah stood in the doorway, smiling at the commotion. She quietly walked out, and Rebecca followed. They walked a little further and found themselves in front of an open door, behind which something large could be glimpsed. It was a library. Rebecca stopped beside her and quietly exclaimed that this library was bigger than the one in the main mansion, and that closing a place like this was a real crime. While Sarah stood silently, her hands pressed her chest, thinking that this was one of the best places she had ever seen in her life. The distillation cube was found in the second laboratory on the fourth floor. Sarah wiped her forehead with her palm and said with genuine relief, "Finally." Teresa was already turning toward the door and calling out to Fran. Sarah noticed this and asked, "Is the distillation cube really that interesting to a blacksmith?" Teresa turned to her with a smile and explained, "Fran's great-grandfather made this cube." Sarah froze, looked at the cube, and muttered quietly, "Wow, that's quite a connection." When Fran approached, he began to examine the cube closely. He grunted heavily, frowned, and said that it needed serious care. He'd like to take it to his workshop to clean and tune it. Just then, Teresa rushed up to him and started shouting, pointing at herself, telling him to wait, that this was her order and he had no right to take her work away. Fran turned to the girl and shouted back that it was something his great-grandfather had made. Teresa wouldn't calm down. She put her hands on her hips and continued menacingly that it didn't matter and that Fran was only there as an escort anyway. Sarah watched their argument closely from the sidelines. Frowning, she sternly told them both to calm down. Then she turned to Teresa and said that she had placed the order with her specifically, so working with the cube was her responsibility. Teresa smirked at Fran and muttered that she was right. But Sarah didn't stop there. She went on to say that the opinion of an experienced craftsman was important too. With a slight smile, she suggested, "How about Fran acts as a mentor and supervises Teresa's work?" The two blacksmiths exchanged glances and nodded in agreement. finding this a suitable solution to their problem. So the task of finding the distillation cube was complete. All that remained was to repair it. A little later, everyone who had participated in the search and exploration of the laboratory was in the garden. It was dusty in the tower, so they had lunch outdoors. Everyone sat down at a small table. Sarah asked. Paracelsus was involved in a truly wide range of research. But what about the hidden results of his work? Maybe no one had just figured them out yet. All the records had been thrown into a pile. Rebecca sighed heavily, frowned, and said that it looked like they were in for endless days of sorting. That's when Alicia offered to help. She cleared her throat awkwardly and said she wouldn't mind sorting through the materials if, of course, they'd let her. The protagonist looked at the girl in surprise and asked if she really wanted to do that. Alicia nodded in agreement, smiled even wider, and said that for an alchemist, this was a true paradise. After all, she would love to live in this tower and continue exploring the legacy of Master Paracelsus. At that moment, the alchemist Theophrastus jumped to his feet and shouted that there was no way she could live in the tower. Alicia started shouting again that he was just jealous. Theophrastus shouted back that, of course, he was very jealous, but that was different. She was planning to live in the tower all by herself. Listening to this conversation, Amelia joined them. With a small smile, she said, "If the girl can't stay alone, then she can move in here too." Then Teresa, clearly inspired, offered her hand and said she could stay as well. The workshop wasn't far at all. Hearing this, Alexander, the pharmacist, began stammering as he tried to come up with an excuse for Amelia to stay here, but he couldn't think of anything. Fran, on the other hand, started yelling at Teresa, asking how her mother would manage without her. The girl just smiled and said her mother would be fine. She'd recently been on a date with a young adventurer. Sarah, watching the whole scene, frowned slightly, but still said with a smile that she couldn't give permission. She needed to ask her uncle or grandfather. The three girls exchanged glances, threw up their hands, and nodded in agreement, saying they would wait. As soon as everyone had calmed down a bit and settled back into their seats, Amelia spoke up. She asked Lady Sarah what experiments she planned to conduct. The girl cheerfully said she wanted to distill Elmo wine. The three invited girls exchanged glances in unison and asked again, "Distilling alcohol?" The main character closed her eyes dreamily and began to explain. First, increase the alcohol content through distillation, then let it age for several years. And finally, when she's ready to drink it, it will be perfectly aged. These thoughts made her head spin, just like a former alcohol lover's. That's when Alexander spoke up. He said that if they were talking about distilling alcohol, that was already the pharmacist's domain. Then he looked at his assistant and said that they used strong alcohol as medicine. Sarah tilted her head and asked, "For example, to disinfect wounds?" Amelia nodded in agreement and said that they also infuse herbs and make medicinal tinctures. Alexander smiled and said that, actually, tinctures were Amelia's specialty. The girl looked flustered, blushed slightly, and, turning to her mentor, said awkwardly, "Well, not as much as he's praising me." Sarah watched this scene from the sidelines and thought that this teacher and student seemed a bit too close for her liking. Then she decided to steer the conversation towards safer ground and asked what kinds of tinctures Amelia made. The girl smiled and said that they were mainly for restoring energy and treating colds, as well as herbal teas. Then the main character decided to ask more about the herbal teas. After all, they're good for beauty, too. Amelia nodded in agreement and said there were blends to improve circulation, reduce swelling, and give the skin a healthy glow. To herself, Sarah thought, frowning slightly, but the maids were listening with bated breath. She could practically feel their eyes on her. Then she slapped her hand down on the table, and she jumped up from her seat, thinking, this is a business opportunity. She turned to Amelia and asked if she'd be interested in developing cosmetics for women. Slightly bewildered, Amelia looked at the main character and asked, "Cosmetics?" But she's a pharmacist. She wants to heal people, not chase after beauty. Sarah turned away and thought to herself with a hint of annoyance. Her ideals were so pure, it was practically blinding. But, frowning slightly, she thought, after all, Alexander had said that according to guild rules, women couldn't become apprentices. That meant women's medicines were definitely in demand, and she couldn't let an opportunity like this slip away. Then a main character stood up and said seriously that she understood Amelia's decision and supported it. And then she continued, "What is feminine beauty, anyway? Glowing skin, slender figures. But isn't all of that the result of good health?" Amelia touched her cheeks with her hands, mesmerized by the speech, and muttered that she was right. The main character continued, placing her hand on her chest. In other words, cosmetics are an extension of the desire to heal women. There are few pharmacists, and many are surely waiting for her specifically. Even right now, she raised her hand toward her maids. They panicked, trying to figure out what they'd done wrong. Noticing everyone's attention, the maids blushed awkwardly. One of them laughed and muttered that it would be very interesting. The other said that when a girl has healthy skin, even her mood improves. To herself, Sarah, looking at her maids, thought that was a great observation. Then she turned to Amelia and saw that she had blushed, closed her eyes, and was leaning thoughtfully on the table. Frowning slightly, Sarah wondered, maybe she'd gone a little too far. Then Amelia stood up and said that she had always regretted a little that she had been born a woman. She couldn't study at the academy. She couldn't join the guild. But even as a woman, she could still choose her own path. Then she folded her hands in a prayerful gesture before her chest, blushed, and looked at Lady Sarah with admiration. She thanked her for showing her the way. To herself, Sarah thought that Amelia had too high an opinion of her. After all, she'd simply caught a whiff of money. Her conscience pricked her slightly, but at the scent of profit, her conscience instantly calmed down. Watching the maids as they looked forward to the cosmetics, the protagonist thought that these would sell well. So the task of exploring the Paracelsus laboratory was complete. All that remained was to continue exploring the tower. Sarah skillfully turned Amelia's suggestion to develop cosmetics into a full-fledged presentation. Now, she was basking in the thought of future profits, and she had no idea that the three girls had come to genuinely admire her. Eyes full of adoration were fixed on her. The girls lined up in a row. Teresa, her eyes sparkling, spoke first. Lady Sarah's conversation with Amelia had inspired them. This meant there was work that only a woman could do. Those adoring gazes nearly overwhelmed Sarah. She hadn't expected things to turn out this way. Feeling awkward, she stepped aside and tried to steer the conversation towards safer ground, saying it was time for them to return to exploring the tower. She took a few steps to the side and suddenly noticed a large gate. Her attention was drawn to the massive gate leaves, covered in moss and cobwebs. Sarah looked at it in surprise and asked the adults what kind of gate this was. Rebecca and Elaine approached her. The maid said the gate wasn't on the map. She frowned slightly as she mentally scanned the estate's layout. Sarah nodded and said they should take a look inside. Elaine frowned and added that they just needed to tidy up the garden a bit. Before she could finish speaking, the main character made a few smooth gestures with her hand, a small smile on her face. And right in front of them, the wind swept away all the grass, all the way to the gate itself. Sarah turned to the adults and asked, "Is this okay?" Elaine nodded, frowning in displeasure, and said that yes, everything was fine. After all, she was already used to such displays of magic. Alexander, Theophrastus, and Fran spoke in unison, shocked. She had already activated magic without a spell. And such immense power, yet with such precision. Was this girl really only 8 years old? They exchanged glances, unable to believe their eyes. So a new item was added to the plan, to investigate the mysterious door. They all walked up to the gate together. Fran pushed against it with his hand, trying to open it. The next second, the doors simply fell to the ground with a dull thud, kicking up a cloud of dust. Teresa immediately rushed over to him and started yelling at him, asking what on earth he was doing. The man hurried to apologize, lowering his head guiltily. But Sarah gave an awkward smile and said that everything was fine. There was no need to worry about it. She decided to walk ahead. Magic cleared the path before them on its own. The grass and branches parted as if an invisible force were moving them out of the way. 3 men followed her, pretending this was business as usual, though they were deeply shocked by such a simple and natural display of magic from an 8-year-old girl. Upon reaching a small clearing, Sarah stopped. Everyone else followed her. She asked in surprise, "Is that really a garden in front of us?" Amelia darted forward, beaming, and said that medicinal herbs and spices were grown in this garden. Sarah, watching the girl's enthusiasm, asked in surprise. The others, Alicia, Theophrastus, and Alexander, hurried over to her. They were all thrilled and began chatting among themselves. "There's juniper, belladonna, and parsley growing there. You could brew anything here. There's even chamomile. And some plants are hard to come by, even for the Pharmacists Guild." They pointed out the bushes and flower beds to one another, unable to hide their amazement. The main character thought to herself, "Now, that's a garden," and she'd thought it was just a thicket. Amelia began talking to her teacher and said that there were plants here from completely different climates, yet they were all growing in one place. Alexander looked at her and asked, "How is that even possible?" Then Rebecca stepped forward and said that it seemed as though this garden was protected by fairies. The main character asked in surprise. The governess explained that Paracelsus had many friends among the fairies. They say the fairies protect this place at his request. Then, glancing around once more, she said that this garden was called the Secret Flower Garden. Then, with a small smile, addressing Amelia and Alicia more directly, she added that they could use the plants freely, but should leave some behind so they could continue to grow. Seeing the girls looking around in awe and beaming with smiles, Rebecca nodded in agreement and said that the fairies would even tell them the names and properties of some of the plants. Sarah glanced at her mentor and asked, "Do you really talk to fairies?" Rebecca nodded and said that she only talked to her friends. Then Amelia spoke up, stepping closer to the plants, and murmured that she'd really like to learn how to do that, too. Rebecca frowned slightly and looked thoughtfully at everyone present. Then she turned to her protégé and the girls standing next to her. She asked if she could take them aside for a moment. Closing her eyes, she said that the parents and maids should wait here. The adult men exchanged glances and asked in surprise, "Is this a secret conversation?" A short time later, all 5 of them were sitting in a small gazebo in the garden. It was quiet all around, with only birds chirping somewhere in the distance. Rebecca sat at the head of the table and asked if they all wanted to talk to the fairies. The 3 invited girls exchanged glances and, in unison, stammering with excitement, asked, "Can we really do that, too?" Rebecca stood up, held out her hands, and said, "To talk to the fairies, you have to become their friend. There are 2 conditions for this." She held up a finger and explained, "The fairy must want to be friends, and you must awaken your magic." The 3 invited girls lowered their heads in disappointment, staring ahead discontentedly, and began to mutter that they hadn't awakened their magic yet. The governess snorted. Then, addressing the main character, she said, "In that case, they should start with Sarah." A soft light immediately appeared above her palms, shimmering in various hues. Then Rebecca asked, "What does Sarah see?" The main character shielded her eyes from the bright glow with her hand and muttered that something was flickering, but she couldn't really make it out. Furrowing her brow slightly, Rebecca looked intently at the girl in her care and asked her to look more closely. She should be able to see them. Suddenly, Sarah began to hear voices. They asked if she could hear them. They were all there. They asked Sarah to open her eyes. The next second, the main character looked around in surprise. Small creatures were floating in the air. A tiny Pegasus the size of a palm, minuscule birds with iridescent feathers, and winged creatures resembling squirrels. Sarah looked around in amazement and exclaimed that little creatures were flying all around her. Rebecca nodded and said with a warm smile that these were the very fairies she'd been talking about. Just then, a strange voice sounded right next to the heroine's ear. It asked if Sarah could see them. The girl looked in surprise at the source of the voice, her shoulder, and saw a cat there, and a talking one at that. Startled and frightened, Sarah jumped up, scaring the little animal away. The cat flew back several dozen centimeters, somersaulting through the air, but a second later, it was back. It said it had been right beside Sarah the whole time, ever since she'd been living with her mom and dad. The girl stared, spellbound, at the flying creature. Sarah apologized for not having noticed it sooner, and then asked what its name was. The cat perched on the main character's elbow, settling comfortably in the crook of her arm, and said she didn't have a name yet, but Sarah could give her one. And, looking at the surprised expression on the girl's face, she explained, "Fairies are given names when they become friends." Sarah froze for a couple of seconds, mulling over different options. Then she asked, "How about Mickey?" The cat immediately broke into a bright smile, revealing her small, sharp fangs. She closed her eyes in delight, thanked the girl, and said that from now on, she was Mickey. The next second, the cat rose above the girl, folded her paws in front of her, and a bright golden light streamed from them, illuminating the main character. Sarah watched the whole scene in amazement, unable to look away. Then the fairy Rebecca, who looked like a small dog with long floppy ears and a fluffy tail, spoke up. She explained that this was a fairy's blessing. Sarah stood there spellbound for a few seconds, thinking how beautiful it was. But suddenly, it was as if she'd been hit over the head with a club. "Wait a minute, a fairy's blessing means." She cried out to her mentor, "Does this mean I'll stay a child forever?" Rebecca laughed with a soft, soothing laugh and said that Sarah would continue to grow until her body was fully formed. The main character exhaled and closed her eyes, feeling the tension melt away. The next second, Mickey settled down beside her and said that Sarah would always be with her now. Then the cat settled onto the outstretched hand the girl had held out just for her, explained that Sarah could change her apparent age at any moment, whenever she wanted. The girl raised her eyebrows in surprise and asked again, "So she could become an adult right now, and then a child again?" Mickey nodded in agreement, squinting slightly, and explained that such an ability was rare among fairies. To herself, Sarah's eyes sparkled, and she thought that she was practically some kind of little sorceress. A pleasant warmth spread through her chest at the thought. Then Rebecca spoke up again. She said it was the young lady's turn now. The girls bowed their heads slightly and mumbled that they hadn't awakened their magic yet, so they couldn't do it. Rebecca winked at them all and told them not to worry. She and Sarah would definitely help. And then, with a more mischievous wink, she added that it seemed they had a penchant for water and fire. Sarah looked at her teacher in surprise, then remembered. After all, she had said that the ability to see hidden attributes was her secret. The governess nodded slightly in response to the girl's unspoken question, then turned to Sarah and asked if she could see the fairies near the girls. Sarah nodded and said yes. They were all around them, floating in the air like multicolored lights. The young lady's eyes lit up, and they thought to themselves that as soon as they awakened their magic, they would be able to befriend the fairies. So a new item was added to the plan to awaken their magic. After a while, they started practicing. Sarah took Amelia and Alicia under her wing, while Rebecca tried to explain what to do to Teresa. It didn't take long at all, and Sarah's students got the hang of it, quite quickly, in fact. Rebecca was very proud of her student and thought to herself that Sarah clearly had a talent for teaching magic. Then the five of them gathered around the table again. Rebecca raised her hands and said that they had all awakened their magic, and now it was time to move on to the next stage. The girls held out their hands in front of them. They closed their eyes and concentrated. The air around them began to vibrate slightly. The next second, a soft light bathed them, and small creatures appeared beside each of them. For Alicia, it was a small fish. For Teresa, a bird. And for Amelia, a creature that was half horse, half mermaid. Sarah watched this, her eyes sparkling and a wide smile on her face. Then she exclaimed that it was time for them to receive the fairy's blessing. For a moment, silence reigned. Nothing was happening. The girls froze in anticipation, but it was still quiet all around them. Sarah was very disappointed. She muttered that just becoming friends didn't necessarily mean they'd receive the blessing. Rebecca nodded and explained that they also needed to have a sufficient supply of mana. Then the main character turned to the girls and realized she'd already assumed there would be more of them. Out loud, she apologized for disappointing them so much. The girls looked at her in surprise. Then they smiled brightly and addressed her. Alicia said she could never have even dreamed of becoming friends with a fairy. It was pure happiness. Amelia said that her fairy had promised to teach her about plants and help her tend the garden. Teresa was the last to speak. Smiling broadly, she said that her fairy would regulate the heat in the forge, which was simply invaluable for blacksmithing. They added that the mere fact that they'd become friends with a fairy was an incredible stroke of luck they'd never dared to dream of. Watching them, Sarah cheered up too. Then Rebecca stepped a little closer to them and said quietly but firmly that the fact they had fairies should remain a secret. All the girls nodded in agreement, pressing their fingers to their lips. Then Rebecca continued, smiling and winking at everyone, adding that they would call themselves the Maidens of the Secret Garden. She asked, "What do you all think of that name?" Sarah walked up to her and asked, "But then Rebecca has to be part of it too, right?" The girl looked slightly embarrassed, averted her gaze, and said she was no longer at an age to be called a maiden. The main character held out her hand and declared resolutely that a woman could be a maiden for as long as she likes. She was uncompromising on this point, for deep down she had already come to terms with the fact that she was a little past 30, but that didn't stop her from feeling young at all. For a while, they all stood together watching the three men and the maids who had remained off to the side. The men were watching them intently, looking clearly excited, shifting from foot to foot and whispering to one another. Sarah said with a smile that it was so exciting. They really did take such good care of the girls. Alicia frowned in annoyance and said that her father was way too overprotective. He'd even come here in person to keep an eye on things. Teresa nodded in agreement, raising her eyebrows, and said that Fran always acted like the senior student, even though he was just like everyone else. Amelia, meanwhile, smiled awkwardly, folded her hands in front of her, and said that Master Alexander was so kind to everyone, not just to her. At that, Teresa smiled brightly and said conspiratorially, "Is it just me, or is Alexander in love with Lady Amelia?" The pharmacist girl immediately exclaimed that there was no way that could be true, but her cheeks flushed bright red as she spoke. Then, clearly trying to change the subject, she added that Lady Teresa was obviously dating Fran. The blacksmith girl immediately protested, "No, they're not dating." Alicia, on the other hand, walked over to her friend, patted her on the back, and said with a chuckle that she thought there really was something going on between them. Teresa blushed even more and mumbled something indistinctly in reply. Sarah watched the whole scene from the sidelines and thought with a warm smile, now that a conversation worthy of the Maidens of the Secret Garden. So, on her to-do list, the items investigate the mysterious door and make friends with the fairy had been checked off. All that remained was to figure out her next steps. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.